So this is our first workshop on eco-marine engineering, specifically focused on introducing ecologically enhanced offshore wind foundations. So there's a vast array of different topics that we can discuss, but obviously today we have a limited amount of time to discuss these topics and a range of great speakers. Any other topics that we haven't discussed today, we'll like to kind of raise for the further workshops will be done on a quarterly basis. So speakers today are Elaine van Onselen from the Rich North Sea, Professor Rick Stafford from Bournemouth University, Will Melhouse from Exo Engineering, and Professor Alex Drumbo from University of Essex as well. And last but not least, Dr. Thomas Cameron from the University of Essex, who I'd like to give the opportunity now to say a few words of welcome.
Thanks very much, William, and thank you very much for you all coming here, including to those of you watching at home, wherever you may be. Somewhere exciting, I hope, and coming to the University of Essex, even if it is via the World Wide Web. It's been an interesting journey working with Exo Engineering, Exo Environmental. I guess it's a good time for me to stop for a second. So if you are watching at home, it's probably a good idea to put yourself on mute. We can't quite hear what you're saying, but we can usually tell that it's either something exciting or not exciting. So you can put yourself on mute. Yeah, so welcome to everyone. We've been working here at the School of Life Sciences with William and the company Exo Engineering and Exo Environmental. It's cousin, sister, brother, sister probably is, for some time. And normally these are questions about biodiversity and coastal biodiversity in some format, and often about how biodiversity can be enhanced through the use of innovative structures for all sorts of reasons, such as coastal defence or links with aquaculture, or in this case, in links with protection of subsea infrastructure. And it's been an enjoyable journey, and we're really excited to have you here with us today to kind of take that journey forward with ourselves and all the other partners and participants today, to try and look at how we can get nature recovery objectives, something we're very interested in life sciences, meeting nature recovery objectives through innovation. So thank you very much for choosing us as your location for the first kickoff of this, and we just hope you all have a really good day and get lots out of it. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm another Will from Exo Engineering, and a couple of us there. And I'm going to be introducing the Living Windfarms project and giving a bit of an overview of what our aims are and how we're going to try to achieve those aims. So whilst I'm doing some introductions, I'll introduce myself. That's a picture of me without any legs. My background is in environmental sciences, and I've got a master's in marine environmental protection as well. And that was really focusing on researching habitat division on marine and coastal structures, as well as comparing them to their natural equivalents. So I know most people in the room and online will have an awareness of what scour protection is and why it's needed. But for anyone that doesn't know, essentially, very simply, it's where the sediment around structures becomes eroded due to the currents that they face in marine, coastal, and I guess intertidal environments. And therefore, scour protection is required to prevent this erosion from undermining the structural integrity of these structures. So some commonly used scour protection methods for offshore wind include using plastic fronds, tire or concrete mattresses, and some large rock armor units as well. So for offshore wind development, you will require scour protection around the base of the turbines themselves, but also for cable routes. And you might also need some sort of rock armor deployment around the landfall infrastructure as well. The most common type of scour protection is usually using hard quarried rock that's then placed or dumped onto the cable crossings or the foundations. And instinctively, the reaction to sort of putting these hard surfaces down on the seafloor might be that that's going to be cause some sort of environmental damage or negative impacts on biodiversity. But as I'm sure will become clear over the course of this workshop, these can actually become an opportunity to enhance biodiversity and restore hard substrate habitats. So this reef effect can be enhanced by using nature-inclusive designs. For example, they can target specific species such as juvenile cod or lobsters, and encourage the bicolonization of sessile species as well. For example, it might be an opportunity to develop and restore some oyster reefs. Despite the growing catalogue of these sorts of solutions, there are a lot of barriers to uptake as well. Firstly, there's a severe lack of evidence proving these artificial reef concepts. If you compare sort of these eco-engineering interventions, if you like, in marine environments and compare them to intertidal or terrestrial environments, you'll see that there's a very large gap in the amount of literature that's published. You've also got issues with the cost per unit when it comes to deployment. Quarried rock is obviously cheap as chips compared to individually winching down these artificial reef units. And that also builds into deployment at scale, is how can you deploy these artificial reefs that are hugely beneficial to biodiversity at a large enough scale for it to become financially viable from a wind farm operation point of view. And lastly, incentives and legislation. There are some things on the way which would be really interesting to find out about if they had incentives for these sort of interventions, such as biodiversity net gain in the marine environment. But yeah, that's something that's on the horizon, which would be interesting to see how it pans out. So the eco-reefs that are designed by Eco-Engineering are designed to really target some of these barriers. So they're designed to be suitable for mass deployment and have a certain degree of flexibility to meet specific criteria with regards to target species or different environments. And alongside this, the idea is that they'll be scalable in terms of production, so we can churn out large numbers of these units to bring that cost per unit down and make it a viable alternative. They also use some of our unique technologies, such as geoblock technology, which is our means of stabilizing cycled materials and byproducts to form a viable concrete type material. And so they can contain up to 90% of this recycled material. And this then helps give us a 17% reduction in carbon emissions compared to conventional concrete. We can also incorporate our green to grey technology, which is our method of creating unique surfaces to facilitate biocolonization. So to the Living Windfarms project, the main aim here is to establish the commercialization of these eco-reef scour protection concepts and incorporate full-scale pilot studies with a focus on mass deployment. As William said, it's led by Eco-Engineering, and we have some lead partners as well, such as the Rich North Sea and the Jan de Nul as well. And it's a 2-year project that's been part funded by the Offshore Wind and Growth Partnership. So how are we going to achieve this aim of mass deployment? First and foremost, we need to understand the loading and deployment methods. And as will become clear when I have a presentation later on today, there are lots of stresses and impacts that each of these processes impart on any unit that you want to deploy. So from loading a unit into the vessel, it might have very high drops, and that's causing an impact, and then deploying it from the ship into the water as well. There's also impacts and stresses there. So we need to be able to address those. And we also need to scale up our production so that we can reduce that cost per unit, as I said before. Alongside this, we have our industry outreach, of which this is our first workshop, and they'll be running on a quarterly basis from here on in. And we also need to test our units as to their strength and their ability to enhance biodiversity. So once we've ticked off those boxes, we can then look at our mass deployment at a real wind farm site in the North Sea. And this will be done using Jan de Nul and a site that they have access to, and that's why they're a really key partner for this project. Once they are deployed, we will have a 2-year monitoring window. This will give us an idea of the initial colonisation, and we'll also be looking at the mobile species there as well. So this means there's lots of opportunities to collaborate within the scope of this project and beyond it as well. And some of the areas that we would like to collaborate on include how can we target the specific species and environments, what's the best way to predict community assemblages, can we form a really nice cost-effective method of monitoring biodiversity, and also understanding the needs from a developer point of view as well. And last but not least, what opportunities arise from up and coming policies and legislation that are coming into force. So you're all here, so you will have found out about us by some way or other, but if you want to stay up to date, then look at the Living Windfarms project website, give us a follow on Twitter, and we also have a newsletter that comes out quarterly as well, which will have lots of updates on this project as it progresses. So that's given you a bit of an overall introduction, and I'll hand over back to William to introduce the company in a bit more detail.
Yeah, so good afternoon again, and just a background about Exo Engineering. So you had a background about the overall project from Will, and after me, Elaine will explain a little bit more what the Rich North Sea does. So I'll make this very brief because I'm sure you're all very interested to hear from all our other keynote speakers rather than about our company. So bear with me on this one and I'll flick through it relatively quickly. So we're an innovative new company focusing on low carbon pioneering nature inclusive solutions for subtidal and intertidal zones at a protected coastal and marine infrastructure, whilst achieving biodiversity net gain. So our main mission statement is to achieve large-scale environmental net gain for coastal and offshore infrastructure using ecological engineering designs. So this is then kind of grouped in 3 kind of main applications: offshore wind, coastal protection, and waterfront infrastructure. So offshore wind is our main target today. Coastal protection is another branch of our company, and we actually work a lot with the Environment Agency on various projects, which are also on our social media and our website if you want to know more. Waterfront infrastructure is more focused on harbours and marinas that want to improve their green credentials. So today is all about subtidal scour solutions, and I think Will has done a really good job with introducing that, so I won't actually go through that again. He's also managed really well on GeoBlock, so you can see our unique surface textures on that rock armor unit. This is a rock armor unit test unit in Cornwall, and you can see the unique hexagon imprints on that. So GeoBlock stands for the innovative use of recycled materials, and then green the grey stands for the use of the unique surface textures. And you can see the same blocks in Cornwall shortly after deployment. So I think some of the photos have been a year after deployment, and possibly another one 2 years if I'm correct, but the blocks have been there, they've been tested for a period, and today they're actually installing 5-ton rock armor units, and I think I might have a picture of that later on as well. So a little bit about the company history. Exo Engineering officially launched earlier this year, so it's a very young company, but it's actually been split off from Exo Environmental, our main company, who specialises in environmental consultancy and surveying. So there is a long timeline of development of the various concepts to the more recent kind of splitting off the 2 companies. And we pride ourselves in a range of unique selling points to support circular economy through GeoBlock, rapid biocolonization through green the grey, and a 17% reduction in carbon through these processes. Also, our products are all scalable, and as I mentioned, we had some trial units of 70 kilos out at New Lynn, which have now been upscaled to 5 tons. And there's some kind of mid-ranges in there as well. And we carry out collaborative research through all the various stages, from concept design all the way to final specification. So just here are some photos. You can see the 75 kilo unit on the left-hand side, and a 700 kilo unit, and then my colleague Isaac standing next to the 5-ton units in Cornwall. So we've specialised in the biocolonisation, but not to forget about the actual functionality of the products. So we've also tested all our products in a flume laboratory of Southampton University. So in particular, today's presentation is focused on offshore wind, and this is just a slide about market awareness. So I think everybody here knows that the offshore wind market is about to grow quite substantially in all corners of the world. So not only here in the UK or Europe, but also in the US and in the China Sea, Taiwan, and other places as well. So very kind of big growth predictions. And we hope that we can be part of that growth, and particularly to improve biodiversity net gain and tackle some of the problems that the oceans face. So here's some of the pictures of the deployment of the 5-ton units in Cornwall, as well as some smaller trial units kind of many moons ago now in Moverons here in Essex. So familiar slide, familiar logos. We are working with various partners on specific areas of this project where we can apply everybody's expertise to assist the project to further develop. So very thankful to have them, and hereby a word of thanks. And that was the end of my presentation, just as a brief introduction. Should you have any questions about the company, please do contact us. And I'm now happy to pass on to Elaine.
Thanks. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eline van Onsla, and I work for the Rich North Sea program. And I'll give you a little bit of an introduction to the program. The program is part of two mother foundations, as we call it. So it's the North Sea Foundation and the Dutch Nature and Environment, or Natuurmilieu Foundation. So this is what William was already talking about, the exponential growth of offshore wind. We're now living in 2022 with 50 gigawatts of offshore wind being operational. And in 2050, this should be 2,000 gigawatts. That's really an enormous growth. In 30 years, in less than 30 years, it shouldn't double. It's not even tenfold, it's 40-fold as it is now. So that's really a lot. So a lot is happening, and I think this offers both risks and opportunities. And this is an image that we're going to have to get used to. Because it'll be our view from now on. So here are both sides of the windmill, of the turbine. There's risks for nature, and there's also opportunities. And that's also the challenge. So we'll start at the risk side. Of course, there's habitat loss, there's collisions, there's things going on above the water surface, but also below the water surface during construction, but also during operation. There's a lot we still don't know about this. For example, electromagnetic fields and the impact on, well, for example, sharks and rays. What happens with them? Are they attracted to it? Are they afraid of it? Do they swim away? We just don't know. What we do see is that a lot of countries focus on avoiding and minimizing effects. So avoiding by placing wind farms on sites where nature isn't as vulnerable maybe as in other sites, and minimizing by mitigating. So for example, using bubble curtains to lower sound levels. However, on the other side of the coin, there's the opportunities. And the opportunities are mostly below the water surface. And what you see here is very interesting because wind farms, and I know the UK is an exception in this, but in most countries, bottom trawling, fishing is not allowed in wind farms. And this really gives an opportunity for, well, at least the benthic flora and fauna to thrive. It gives, well, new resting areas, but it also offers new hard substrate areas where, well, habitats can really develop. And here's also where the opportunities arise, where we can enhance nature a little bit, where we can make it even better. And that's why the Rich North Sea was born. We really focus on those opportunities. So we do not forget about the risks, and that's why our mother foundations still come in, but our program really focuses on the opportunities that offshore wind brings to nature. We partnered up with several industry partners to really learn by doing, and we set up several offshore pilot projects. And these are our main projects right now. So we have 5 different offshore projects in wind farms in the Netherlands right now. We also work on an oyster hatchery for flat oysters, and we have an offshore test site, and I'll just quickly run through our projects. So this is our Gemini project, which is in the north of the Netherlands, where we try to restore oyster reefs. We place substrate and we place live oysters, and we do this together with our partners. This is Hollandse Kust Zuid, another offshore wind farm in the Netherlands. And here we work on a nature inclusive design, where we make use of water replenishment holes, and we measure both inside and outside of the foundation of a monopile, and see, well, how life develops both within and outside of the foundation. The offshore test site we have is very nice because we can actually go diving in there and see how things develop. So we use this to test different structures and different artificial reefs, both practically, how do you deploy such a thing, how do you monitor it, but also scientifically together with, for example, NEOS and bioecology. Then another offshore wind farm, we have partnered up with Wageningen Marine Research. And we're looking at the development of biodiversity around artificial reefs or fiber reefs, specifically looking at lobster, which we tagged, and trying to figure out their behavior as, well, predatory, but also very, well, species that stick to their home, so to say. And then last but not least, there's Blauwind, which is very close to the other side where we tagged the lobster. And here we deployed oyster tables. Oh, I'm saying it's the last one, it's not actually. We have another one after this one. And we monitor biodiversity development as well. Oh, I think I missed one, but then we also have our Luchterdijnen project. And we just deployed oysters in oyster tables as well. Only 2 weeks ago. So that's my relation to this one. So my main message here is to be bold and think big, and also to act fast, because a lot is coming our way. And if we don't jump on the train right now, we're going to miss it. Thanks. Yeah, I think I'll hand it back to you, Millie.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think there's room for some questions. Will you have to do that?
Well, I was just going to introduce everyone to how it's going to work now for the rest of the session, is we're going to try and create some degree of interactivity so that everyone online and in the room can be involved. Oh, there we go. Okay, we're on to the first question. So what should happen is, everything's running smoothly, is this should generate a nice word cloud for everyone to see where people are joining from. So yeah, if you put country, county, and we'll get a nice idea of where everyone's tuning in from. Yeah, it's working, that's always a promising start. Yeah, it's a good spread of people tuning in from all over the place, so that's exciting. And similarly, if you could just sort of enter like an overview of your job title as well, that'd be interesting to see what positions people hold that are interested in this topic. Again, a really interesting spread of people there. Yeah, that looks like that might be it. So the final one before moving on to some of the actual presentations, would you just be able to enter what your main topic of interest is for today? Lots of interest in scour protection and marine biodiversity in the North Sea there. Okay, so now that all seems to be working pretty smoothly, I'll hand you back over to Elaine, who will talk a little bit about scour protection and marine biodiversity in the North Sea, and have a lot of interactions in her presentation as well.
Thanks, Paul. Okay, so hello again. I think we can jump straight in because I'm going to tell you a little story about the history of the North Sea. But first, I would like to ask you a question. So, what do you think this status of the North Sea ecology is right now? 1 being really bad, 10 being perfect, unblemished. Okay. So we have, well, I would say 6 being just okay. This is quite a low mark, I think. I mean, if I would get this mark on my test, I would fail. So I think right now we could safely say that, well, the environmental status or the ecological status of the North Sea is not, well, it's not great, I think. Do you see the development of offshore wind as an opportunity for nature? Okay, that's great. I don't see anyone saying no yet. Yeah, that's nice. Well, we've had some discussions on this, so it's nice to be in a room where people see this as an opportunity. 27. I don't know how many people we are in total, but I think it's pretty clear. Yeah. Okay, that's great. Okay, so let's go into the history a little bit. I just saw that we have a very varied audience. So some of you already know a lot about this. Some of you may not know a lot about it. So I'll just give you a bit of a story about our own North Sea. Because it's a really, well, I think this picture it's kind of blurry, but it gives an impression because our North Sea is quite a young sea. And during the last ice age, we could walk from the UK to the Netherlands. And only when the ice caps started melting did it fill up. And that means it's young, but it's also very shallow. And it's really a unique environment. That also means that the North Sea has never been without people. We basically grew up together. Sometimes we still fish up some evidence of people living in the Doggerland, or which is now the Dogger Bank. So we know we've always lived together, and that's also what you see in our history books. And here you see one example from this book by Adriaan Koenen, where you see that we always used to sea. And it started on the coast, but it didn't take a long time for us to start exploring the open sea as well. So during the 17th up until the 19th century, and after, of course, as well, shipping and fishing really grew. Our ships literally grew, so they really got a lot bigger. And we really started to explore, but also exploit the sea. So fishing grew, whaling grew, and we really started to harvest from the sea, which means that also the pressure begins to build on the seabed, but also on the ecology. Of course, oysters are a very nice example because everyone loves to eat oysters, but they're also very easy to fish out. They don't swim away. As long as you have the proper gear and you know where to find them, it's very easy to take them out. And probably most of you already know the picture, the map on the right here, It's from Olsen in 1883, and it gives us a little bit of an insight of what the North Sea floor used to be like, where there's a really big red patch above the Netherlands where there used to be oyster grounds, which have disappeared, or we've fished out. And the Industrial Revolutions really intensified the pressure on the ecosystem. Large species and large individuals really started to disappear. And in these pictures, I always think these are very nice pictures to tell the story, because we almost can't imagine species like this being in our North Sea. Large halibut, large skates, common skates, but also tuna. This is bluefin tuna. And the sad thing about this is, back then, at the beginning of the 20th century, we didn't have the means to properly store these fish, so they would rot in the harbor because we couldn't cool them. And right now we would be able to process this, but there's no tuna in the North Sea anymore. And then new players emerged as well. So we have oil and gas extraction. We have sand extraction. There's cables, there's pipelines. Of course, there's the military doing things on the North Sea. There's shipping, but there's also cultural heritage, dredging, fishery, of course, recreation. There's really a lot going on. And if you look at the little, well, I will always call it a piece of the pie, the EEZ of the Netherlands. It's really small, but there's a lot going on. Well, and now, of course, the newest player is offshore wind, and it brings another pressure into the system. But what about nature? We have a lot of pressures right now. And we can safely say that the ecosystems that we work in are already degraded. The environmental status of most of our habitats, well, it's quite bad. And the good environmental status from the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, well, they're not met. And this is an example for the Netherlands. Of course, it's different because the UK, well, stepped out of the EU, but I can tell you that it's not a lot better if you would put it in a table like this. There's a lot of red going on. So right now we work in a system where there used to be a lot more hard substrate. But what's the value of hard substrate habitats? I'm not saying that soft substrate habitats have no value. It's just a different habitat. But what you do see is that hard substrates are needed, well, in some cases for certain species. For example, for reef formation, for settlement. A lot of species are attracted to this. So reef building species, for example, such as oysters or other shellfish, or maybe even tube worms, which then in turn attract other species. So reef associated species, but also species that benefit from this. So biodiversity generally is high in reef habitats, and it's also a spot of high variety. Let's go to some interaction again. We can't have the massive rollout of offshore wind before we do something about the environmental status of the North Sea. What do you think? And I was hoping there would be some opinions on this, but yeah, it does differ a little bit. So I would like to ask someone who says true if they want to share their thoughts about this.
I actually put it's true. I was hoping there was another box, to be honest.
In between.
Because I think unless you plan for environmental improvement, unless that's done in conjunction with wind farms, it's very difficult to then achieve it. So unless you have a plan, you don't have any direction. So actually creating the direction and the plan first to then achieve that objective is probably better than building wind farms and then kind of thinking about the environment later. So that would be my opinion.
Yeah, nice, good to hear. Anyone else maybe online wants to share about this? Okay, we'll go to the next one. Because of the degraded ecosystem, hard substrate habitats currently have more worth than soft substrate habitats. There's a big sigh here in the room.
Too much context.
Yeah. Well, please share your thoughts.
What's worth mean? What did you mean when you said worth?
When you, yeah, well, it can be anything. So
Well, in that
it
case,
can
it's
be
an-
intrinsic, it can be a value for money, it can be
But the answer may differ depending which of those that you decide on a given moment that that's what you meant.
right. It's a very scientific answer. Let's see. Does anyone else want to share something about this?
Well, what about if we pitch the question differently? That hard substrate habitats are under more threat than soft substrate habitats.
That's a good one.
Exactly. Then I can answer the question.
Yeah. Oh, do you want to answer that question?
Well, I would say that it's true, and I'm happy with it. But, you know, the biodiversity contribution from soft sediments could be more important for denitrification, for all sorts of other particularly ecosystem functional services than hard substrates ever will.
Mm.
Whereas they may make a lower biodiversity contribution in species richness.
Yeah.
So there's all sorts of different ways to answer the question.
Yeah,
So it's
true.
Yeah, I'd say you've got to look at it from a policy and legislation perspective as well, because perhaps regs in terms of protection ordered to soft substrates. If we're looking at deployment of offshore wind, equally is important, literally more so in terms of what we can and can't do.
Yeah, good one. I'm seeing Paul online has a hand raised. So go ahead, Paul.
Can you hear me, Alina?
Yeah, perfectly.
Okay,
Thanks.
thank you. Yeah, I think that, of course, this is more a tentative kind of feeling answer, but I would say that because the hard substrate historically has been removed, and therefore the ratio of hard substrate versus soft substrate has been changed drastically over time, it's not that the soft substrate has, the hard substrate has become more rare, basically, and therefore I would say that in terms of conservation effort, there's no shortage of soft substrate, but the hard substrate also introduces other biological and ecological communities, basically, that have less habitat now than you would have had in the past prior to human intervention. So therefore, I agreed with this notion, not purely from ecological perspective, but also historically speaking. It's kind of like we took the forest down and we can replant the forest. It doesn't say that the soil itself is not worth anything, but the forest was the thing that was removed, not the soft soil.
Thank you. I think that's a very nice, yeah, very nice way to put it. Let's see if I see any other hands. Okay. Thank you, Paul. Okay. So what happens if we put a wind farm in an offshore environment? Well, immediately you see a reef effect. And this is true for basically any hard substrate that you place inside the sea. So usually you see well, things like this, and I'll show you a short video of some scour protection in an offshore wind farm. I'm hoping everyone will be able to see this. It's just a short impression of one of the wind farms we work in.
Can everybody see the video?
I don't see any no's.
No. No.
No.
No, I think we just have to go back to
You share.
the share.
Ah, there we go.
Yeah.
This one. Yeah. Okay. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Yes. Let's go again. It's just to give you an impression. And what you see is there's life there as soon as you put in the rocks and the scour protection. This wind farm is a little bit older. So it was operational in 2015. So there is some succession. Yeah, but there's anemones, there's worms of all kinds. There's starfish, well, and I could go on, crabs, lobsters, and also a lot of fish. Okay, let's see if I can go back to sharing the presentation. Mentimeter, there we go. Okay. But what we do see is that artificial hard substrate is never as rich as natural hard substrate. So you can't really see it as a substitute for natural hard substrate. So for example, like gravel beds or rocky sediments. And there's also a lot of things we don't know yet. For example, on a turbine, a lot of filter feeders will grow. So in the subtidal shallow zone, usually mussels will grow. In the deeper zones, it's mainly amphipods and anemones. And we don't really know the carrying capacity for filter feeders in the North Sea. If we really are going to build all the wind farms that we're planning to build, this might really have an effect on the ecosystem, might have an effect on primary production, and in the end have an effect on the entire food web. And we also don't really know the ecosystem effects in soft sediments, so between the turbines and between the wind farms. And then it all connects to each other. So there's offshore wind, which may have an effect, and it may have an effect on nutrients, on currents, on waves. But offshore wind is not the only player, right? We have mining, we have climate change, we have fishing, and it all interacts with each other. And these ecosystem effects are very hard to predict, but they will happen. And I think it's up to us to say if it's worth the risk or if it's not. So another question. Scour protection gives enough of a reef effect as is. So nature enhancement is not necessary. I would love to ask someone who said yes to take the floor. If anyone's willing to speak up. You see if there's anyone online who said yes to this question, or maybe here in the room. Don't be afraid. Don't bite.
I genuinely don't know. I don't know, so I didn't answer.
Yeah, no, that's okay. We don't know everything. Yeah.
Is there any evidence that is there any comparison done between the various substrates? Can we actually answer that question with confidence?
Well, there has been some research that says that any sort of artificial substrate doesn't give as much richness or variety as natural substrates. So there's that, but then there's also the question in itself does placing artificial substrate and creating a reef effect, does it have worth in itself? I mean, you might be placing or creating a hard sediment habitat in a location where there didn't used to be one, where it's soft sediment by nature. So do you even want a reef effect there? Or you might be able to, or you might want to make your footprint as small as possible. Yeah, so it's an interesting discussion. And that's also where this question comes from. So hard substrate in the soft sediment environment should not be stimulated, because we are placing wind farms in areas where there never was hard substrate to begin with.
It's a bigger question behind this, though, isn't it?
Yes.
In terms of what we want from our North Sea.
Exactly.
After that.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a big discussion. How do we want to, rethink our own environment? Does anyone who says false want to elaborate a little bit on this? Maybe someone online? I see Paul has a hand still up. Is this one left, or is this from this question?
That's a new hand.
Then go ahead, Paul.
Thank you. I would say for this one, really, there's really two trains of thoughts here. Some people think that if something wasn't there, that we shouldn't do anything, and I think that really we should look holistically at the system and say that it is constantly shifting, and I think it's a missed opportunity to stick principally to what was there before. Let's only restore that, because the general carrying capacity of the North Sea has decreased majorly over time, and I think we should not overlook any opportunity to increase the carrying capacity by doing some interventions in places where, yeah, historically they weren't there, but that does not invalidate the potential of hard substrate. Of course, there is risks of invasive species and other ecological effects, and this should be done in I think progressive scales, not directly doing full football fields, but trying to monitor and learn. But at least we should do something. I think that if you would do it true on this one for this notion, then yeah, it might be hard to really implement that carrying capacity again.
Thank you. Anna, do you want to add anything to that?
Thank you. I actually wanted to ask a question to you and Paul. I'm a civil engineer, so I don't have a lot of the background that other people in this virtual room have. And I have a question about the hard substrate loss. You said that in the North Sea there used to be more hard substrate. I'd like to understand if that has been quantified, and also how the substrate was lost, because I understand that all the pressures like overfishing that you showed would reduce biodiversity, but I do not understand how they would reduce the physical habitat itself. And this new question that is up now is also related about putting hard substrate where there's only soft sediment, but are these areas where there used to be hard substrate in the far past, and there's not anymore? If you could explain about this a bit, I would appreciate it.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for the question. I will answer for the Netherlands, because I'm not sure about quantifying it for the rest of the North Sea, but in the Netherlands there used to be about 30% used to be reefs, and this can be so rocky reefs, but it can also be biogenic reefs. So for example, flat oysters, they create hard substrates by forming reefs. So they grow on top of each other, and then they form their own reefs. So if you fish them out, you essentially, remove the entire habitat. So we both fished out the biogenic reefs by removing shellfish, for example, but we also fished out really large rocks and other settlement opportunities. If you look in the Netherlands, in fishing towns, for example, there's always large rocks because fishermen don't like it because they will get into their nets. So if they fish them up, they will not put them back and they will leave them on shore. And this hasn't been quantified because it's really difficult to know what it used to be like, but we do know that a lot has been removed. And at least in the Netherlands, what I was saying was 30% was hard substrate habitat, so either biogenic or rocky, and now it's closer to zero. And maybe anyone from the UK can elaborate a little bit on the UK situation.
It's very similar.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's also a danger of hanging everything on just native oyster. I mean, there are dozens and dozens of species that form biogenic reefs in the North Sea, from horse mussels to even what you might not think of as reefs, but what I would say is mixed sediment shellfish dominated habitats. You know, even a cockle sand system or a surf plant system has such a high percentage of hard mixed structure. And there are a number of things from the things we know about fishing, and that fishing can shift towards hard-bodied systems if, for example, because the activity kills all the soft-bodied organisms and only the hard ones are left. But particular modern fishing practices that disturb the sediment so much that it pushes those structures to a density below which you've broken the habitat type. So you still might have flat oysters there, cockles there, clams there, but it's essentially a form of what we call an Allee effect. That you've pushed the density of these organisms so low that they're no longer able to form beds or reefs or whatever you want to call it, but the habitat that they would normally engineer. And once they've got to that state, they will not be able to naturally recover. or at least not recover quickly or easily. So I'd say yes, it is the same in across the whole North Sea, because if it is a sedimented system, even if it's lost some of its hard and mixed sediments, it's still a sedimented system. And I don't think the behaviours of it in this part of the North Sea are really that different to what would have been on the continental, mainland continental side.
Yeah, thank you. Does that answer your question, Anna?
Yes, thank you very much for the detailed explanation.
Thanks. Okay, let's continue. We should focus on the local habitat type of offshore wind farms when implementing nature enhancement, or we should focus on the system as a whole when implementing nature enhancement. So for example, remember the red patch of oyster beds that there used to be north of the Netherlands? Should we focus on things like that? Or should we say, okay, we have an opportunity outside of that area and we're going to work with oysters anyway? I see a lot of people leaning towards the latter. So I'd like to ask someone who says, okay, we should focus only on the local habitat type to say a little bit about this. Maybe someone from online joining us. Come on. You can do it. Yeah. Or maybe anyone in this room also said former.
I didn't say former, but I can see an argument for it. So from a consensus perspective, you consider the project its own merits in terms of a mitigation that would require you look at that from a local perspective. Obviously, others myself in terms of what we should be doing in terms of considering the system across the North Sea, wider, that may support a better outcome.
Yeah. That connects to what you said before as well. Yeah, definitely. Thanks. Okay, let's continue. So using artificial reef units instead of natural stone for scour protection would be a long-term sustainable solution. What do you think? And here I'm making the assumption that artificial reef units are more like natural hard substrate habitats than just the regular scour protection. Okay, so I see that's true, but I see two false. Anyone wants to elaborate on that? I also have cookies. I can start, handing out people who dares to give an answer. Not to the online crew, though. Don't be afraid to speak up.
So I put false.
Yeah.
So, the idea of something being long-term and sustainable, but requiring artificial units to be put in on a scale large enough to make a difference, compared to a naturally occurring sort of phenomenon of natural stone. It just seems the two don't really, to me, to sit together very well.
Yeah, yeah.
But I appreciate some people are building a business on that point, so maybe not.
Yeah.
Should we be constantly putting in artificial reefs like forever, or should nature at some point be taking in?
Yeah, yeah. I think that's really good.
Okay.
Thanks. Yeah, yeah.
Can I?
Yeah, you can respond. Please do. Yeah.
So I get it. I'll give you some of the absurdities if you go for it. So as an example, for using natural stone that meets requirements for policy, for example, in local marine restoration projects, we've had to ship in stone that's quarried very far away from here and pay the transport and carbon costs to get it here as a brand new product from the earth, right? Whereas in some scenarios, it might be that products that we might not think is from a good source, let's say dredging, as an example. If we're not happy with it, we don't like it, we'd rather do it, but it's happening and it has a byproduct and it's here on your doorstep. What do you do with it? Do you bury it in landfill? Or do you repurpose it and it actually reduces the lifetime cycle carbon footprint
of the restoration project you're trying to do on your doorstep. So there's some absurdities and things in the system that are ranked in the system that I would have thought, well, we could just get some local stone and it will be okay. Turns out we weren't, for whatever reason, we weren't allowed. And sometimes the reason why I said true is not because one way or another, you're going to put scour protection on risers and cables in the North Sea, one way or another. If we're going to have those risers and cables, the question is then, what are they made of? I get your point about it. We're going to keep going and doing it. If it was just biodiversity, no. But one way or another, we're putting scour protection in. The question is, what should it be made of?
But surely the question is why we're putting scour protection in. If it's fisheries, then surely in terms of a root cause solution, it's a question of special prioritization and zoning.
Absolutely, I wasn't thinking about fisheries. It's just the idea of protection from currents.
This is a problem, isn't it? Yeah, in terms of what frame of reference do we have and how do we approach these problems?
Yeah.
So another way to put that question is, are artificial reef units or natural stone a long-term sustainable solution?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well,
I think Will's presentation later will touch upon this as well, because what we found as well is that natural stone like basalt granite is very, very hard as well, very dense in that sense, very difficult for organisms to cling on to and build a habitat upon, and more porous or softer materials, possibly like a sandstone, for example, as natural stone, could be more easily colonized. So there is also some discussion there on shipping in rock or stone from Norway or Cornwall or Scotland. Is it the right type of rock for colonization, or is it actually simply too dense and too hard to colonize easily?
Okay, let's continue. So most of you will probably know this image, but I'll go through it shortly anyways. Because one way or the other, we are creating an impact. If we're placing a wind farm or any other type of structure into our North Sea ecology, we are impacting it. And the first step into having less impact is to avoid certain areas. So avoiding very sensitive areas, for example, by placing your wind farm in another area. Then we want to minimize the effects. So for example, by placing bubble curtains, by using pingers, things like that to minimize your impact. But then on the other side of the coin, we also want to bring something, right? I think net gain is a very popular term right now. We want to restore what used to be there. But even if we restore around our turbine or on our turbine, the turbine is still there and we're still having an impact. So we need to take one extra step to offset certain effects. And offsetting here is very, very important, because if we don't do that, we still are creating an impact. So we don't have the net positives that we really want. And offsetting is quite, well, it's difficult, especially in a marine environment. What are you going to do to help build your ecosystem to restore, while also wanting to have, well, a bigger footprint and more use of the sea? And this is very difficult with offshore wind. And here's another image of this, where the initial state of the environment, well, it's in equilibrium. And basically what we've been doing for hundreds of years is just putting impacts on one side of the scale, without thinking about the other side of the scale. And once we started to think about it, we're just thinking about avoiding and mitigating. And right now, we really, really have to look at, well, at offsetting and really how to get that scale into balance once again. And then the question is, how much is enough? When is our ecosystem in balance, and what do we think is acceptable? So does the offshore wind industry have an obligation to avoid and minimize negative effects on nature? I think in most countries, this is already obligatory, right? To minimize your effects. I also see that in your answer because no one says false. So I think that's really a no-brainer. So let's go to the next one. Do they also have an obligation to restore and offset negative effects? And here I also want to add that offshore wind is not the only player here. And for the last hundreds of years, they haven't been there. And they start to work in a degraded system where most of the impacts have been from other sectors. So are they still responsible now to bring it into balance again? And here I see it differing a little bit. Does anyone want to elaborate on their answer?
You should have obligation.
We should have,
That's,
yes.
that's why, I mean, that's why I read it here.
Yeah, okay.
Rather than actually don't have it.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right now well, in most of the cases, they don't have an obligation yet, but they should have. Okay, yeah, good one. Paul, do you also want to add anything?
Thank you, Eline. Yeah, I think that what you mentioned before also ties into, of course, this topic is the restoration part. Right? You mentioned actually, okay, well, we want to restore something, but we also have the monopiles there, so that's already an impact. I think really, if we think about it, it's an ideal, but restoring what was there is something that I think is going to be a very far from our bed show if we keep it in a Dutch sentence, because already the North Sea ecosystem has changed so much from what it was. So I think that we should leave be that notion of trying to restore what there was and just try to see how the system is right now and see how we can maximize carrying capacity and try to, you could say, within the spirit of what it was, maybe restore it, but getting it back to what it was, even if you would literally flatten the landscape, bring it exactly back to the square meter where it was before and having all infrastructure removed, you will not get back the same species dynamics and ecological habitat. So really, I think that notion of restoring it is a tricky one. That's why I also answered no here. I believe that we should view it with the current position of where it is right now and how we can best offset the negative effects on nature. But restoring, I think, really is a step too far.
Thank you. I think that's also something that we don't talk about enough, and that's definitions. Because in the offshore wind industry, we talk about restoration, we talk about protection, we talk about nature enhancement, we talk about all kinds of things. And sometimes the definition is just not clear. So I think that's a really good one, Paul, to bring up.
And also talk about this an obligation. So there is actually room within, I can only talk from a UK policy perspective, but there's a room for obligation. So there is room for saying that a given authority or a given state or a given area has an obligation for recovery or restoration, which are different terms.
Yes.
And that would be a legal obligation. And then there's also the should that Rick's picked up on, the kind of, do I feel that it's morally correct that a business should be? And, you know, they're different questions, but one of them could help move us to a place where planning permission is always, as it is becoming increasingly in the terrestrial and coastal landscape, you know, is it has a legal obligation to recover. And the points from Paul, I mean, absolutely, I'd say reiterate that.
Yes.
There is species-based projects like the native oyster project you put in, which is, you know, got lots of interesting questions within it about what would success look like. And then there is essentially recovery or rewild, or you know, they appear to be more achievable and they appear to be maybe more realistic given the North Sea is already much warmer than it used to be.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks.
Eline, can you hear me?
Yeah, hi, Siska.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
hi. Hi, thanks. Yeah, no, I want to respond also on this statement, because I don't think it will, well, this is well, sorry, for the ones who don't know me, I work for Vattenfall on offshore wind. So this is one of my topics I think a lot about, of course. And one of the issues with offsetting is if you want to do it, or maybe if it's an obligation, if you need to do it, is it allowed and is it possible in your offshore wind site? And if not, sometimes you want to do something outside your offshore wind farm, and at the moment there's no legal basis for that. That's not possible. So that's something to keep in mind, that I think at the moment an obligation would be too strong. But of course, yeah, everybody is thinking about it. But yeah, that's what I wanted to say. It's too far going at the moment.
Yeah, thanks for your input. And it's also something that what we come across, where we want to be able to have a nature restoration or nature enhancement project, and we just legally can't. And that's definitely a problem right now. So offshore wind farms can help in restoring or creating nature. And this is based on the place. So it's also what Sietske just mentioned, only on the assets. So the turbines, the scour protection themselves, they can help in restoring or creating nature inside the offshore wind farms, maybe also outside or anywhere in the North Sea.
Yeah, Sietske here again. While the answers are coming in, I also want to, yeah, of course, this is all about offshore wind, but I think we are only one of the players, and I think you already mentioned it. But you can't expect that offshore wind developers will restore the degraded North Sea ecosystem. That's not possible. I think it's not doable for the sector. I think we want to play our part, of course, but all the other users of the sea should also do something in restoring and creating nature. Of course, in the ideal world, even fishermen, the vessels, etc. So of course, yes, we want to take our role, and I think we can make a difference. But I would plead to, that we're not the only ones.
Thank you. I think that's good input. I also see a hand from Anna. Do you want to add anything to this?
Just a quick follow-up to Sietke's information here. I think the previous slide you had with the question about the obligations would also be interesting if you change offshore wind industry by any other industry that affects marine ecosystems, like industrial fisheries, transportation industry, and understand how we would reply to the same question just with changing the industry. And are we looking at offshore wind in a different way that we look at other industries? It's just a good way of doing some soul searching. And why do we think that this industry in particular could have the obligation from the get-go?
I think part of this is because it's the new player in the field, and we are planning such an enormous scale up. I think that's why we're all looking at offshore wind. That doesn't mean we shouldn't look at the other players, right? So I think that's very good input.
There's also a thing about missing the opportunity with other players. And we weren't thinking about this when we invested in oil and gas infrastructure in the 60s and 70s. So there's I totally get and feel the sympathy of that the argument towards that statement made. Part of it is just windows of opportunity. And if there was someone asking for a new oil and gas tender right now, today in the North Sea, all these questions would be asked of that tender. But none of it was asked, which is what has led to some of the programs about decommissioning, like colleagues here are working on. So now looking at biodiversity in the decommissioning phase as opposed to the building phase. And when we say other players, I'll come back to in a minute, but in the terrestrial environment, this is exactly what we do. You know, so we're already into bringing in for any, we've got this offsetting, and we're not getting it right, but it's there.
Yeah.
We consider this with planning applications and development on land. But I do have a lot of sympathy for the point about bringing up fishing or shipping on the basis that it's not easy to imagine how they could. And it is definitely easy to imagine how wind could, and I understand the concern maybe that wind's been picked on, and I don't think it is. I think it's been because we view wind positively. It's not because we view it negatively, it's because we view it positively, that there's a lot of love that for what could be achieved, rather than thinking of it as that we believe you should solve everything. I think just did, you know, because I understand why Anna and I've forgotten the other name, but Jessica brought up those points, and they were good points.
Yeah, yeah. And I also want to add, times are really changing. And right now, for example, bottom trawling, if you would compare it with current legislation and nature testing and things like that, they probably wouldn't get a permit if they would ask it right now. But because it's a long-standing sector, it's a different story. Same goes for oil and gas. And what can other sectors do? Well, then of course it's easy to say, well, maybe we can add something financially and create a nature restoration fund or something like that for all offshore parties. But that's also really a point to discuss in the future. For now, actually.
Yeah, it gets sometimes very frustrating when you have that cross-sector collision, if you like, with native oyster restoration projects happening here in Essex in the Blackwater, but oyster fishing still continuing, and you can buy native oysters on the market in London, for example. So one party is trying to restore, and the other party is still fishing out, and yeah, it's not really a fair situation.
Yeah, and that's interesting. We don't have that in the Netherlands because we already fished out everything. But then
resolve the problem.
It is important to say, and I've got to say, that we wouldn't be restoring native oysters in Essex if it wasn't linked to
fair point.
A fishery.
Yeah.
Because of the complexities that are different from the public fishery in the Netherlands and many other places, it's our oystermen that have shown us that restoration was possible, and therefore we're copying what they're doing, but in the wild. If that makes sense. So there is some utilitarianism about that particular case study.
Yeah, and I also think that this sector can also give it a push, right? If they notice that it's not going very well with the population, then it might be an incentive to do something about it.
Yeah.
Okay. So what can we do? Well, nature enhancement, of course, what we've been talking about. A nature enhancement can be anything, can be passive or active. So protection, marine protected areas can also be nature enhancement. So basically doing nothing is also an option. Restoration and habitat creation. And the latter one, so habitat creation or optimization, this is where I think, optimizing, for example, scour protection falls under. So you have nature inclusive designs of assets that are being placed, optimization, but also, for example, placing broodstock structures of species that wouldn't come back by themselves. So, for example, flat oyster. So how can we optimize scour protection? Well, we can make it as close as possible to natural hard substrate. And this will give a higher species richness and also higher biodiversity. And options for this is adjusting the size, adjusting the shape, but also playing around with the material. So not everything has to be concrete, but you can also use shell material, for example, so natural material to really create a nice, nice substrate for species to settle upon. But what's very important in this is that it should be scalable. With the amount of offshore wind that's coming, we want it to be scalable because we don't want to keep on playing around on a little stamp size plot, but we really want to scale this up. And currently we run into quite a lot of barriers. Most of the projects that we work on or that we know of are in the pilot stage, but there's really no time to wait for all the conclusions and for all the research to end, because offshore wind is happening now. And if we really want to scale up, and if we want to have all new offshore wind farms to be nature inclusive and to use, well, nature inclusive scour protection, for example, we have to act now. And that's difficult because, of course, governments and developers, they say, well, show me the proof first before we invest in it. And well, yeah, we don't have a lot of proof yet. Of course, the costs are also a barrier right now. It costs a lot. But if you look at the scale, what offshore wind and building offshore wind farms cost, making a more nature inclusive design, well, what percentage of the entire wind farm would that be? Then there's also the problem of decommissioning. And that's in the Netherlands, everything that you put in, you have to take out. So we have to plan on taking all our artificial reefs out. So if you are going to replace your scour protection with artificial reef units, you're going to have to plan to take them out again. And this is definitely a problem. Also, monitoring options are quite limited offshore. It's expensive, it's hard, the environment it's just difficult to get there. There's weather, there's waves, there's current. It's not as easy as on land. So this makes it even harder to collect proof of certain concepts. And in that case, well, optimal designs are unproven yet. So we don't know what works best. And lastly, wind farm operators or developers, they also need more incentives for scaling up. Right now, we see a lot of goodwill, and pilot projects are forming, but really to create large-scale effects, we have to put more incentive in, for example, tenders or regulations. And that's what you see right now in the Netherlands, where we had the Hollands Kust West tender, which was focused on ecology, and that's where real innovation is born. So what can we do right now? Well, we really have to start learning by doing. And that's what we do with the Rich North Sea as well. We have a lot of pilots going on, but we also want to lobby at the same time to scale up. We have to keep on monitoring, even though it's difficult and it's expensive, because that's the only way we will get answers. We have to create a long-term vision on our North Sea habitat. So what is it that we want? And we have to look at the potential for scaling up. Offshore wind is not the only player, and we have to look beyond its borders, also to put pressure on nature conservation, marine protected areas to really help the system to be less degraded as it is. And here is also where we need to share knowledge and work together. And we think that nature enhancement should be anchored in national regulation and international and national law. So what do you think is the most important next step to take in offshore wind and nature enhancement? Very nice to see a lot of helpful things here. And I also think that well, of course, we're all in this together, so we really have to learn from each other and take these sort of steps and try to bring it further. So North Sea countries have to start nature enhancement in offshore wind farms inside their own exclusive economic zones. Or North Sea countries should work together cross-border. Interesting. Because if I would have to pick one, I would say start in your own EEZ, because it's a place to start. But I also think that is not the one can also, they can exist next to each other, right? Does anyone from online want to say something about this?
I can say something again, Aline, but then I'm talking too much.
Let's see if there's anyone else. If not, then you can go ahead. Both, yeah. Ines says both is needed. I can't agree more. Paul, what do you think?
I think the start is a key word here. And what you mentioned, yeah, you might more easily start within your own EEZ. At the same time, if we do the latter, it invites us to think in a more holistic way of where nature is and how we can support her. And that crosses international boundaries. It's that simple. And therefore, I think that really would inspire more EU-wide and Eurozone-wide regulation and standardization, which will also help the industry. So I would always say the latter.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and of course, ecology doesn't know any boundaries. So that's always a good incentive to work together. Thank you for your attention and your input. I think we have 5 minutes or something for questions, maybe.
Yeah, there's a little bit of time left for questions for those online or in the room that want to ask a question. Then we'll break off until 2:30 our time for some refreshments, bullet breaks. So we'll turn off the camera in a little bit. But are there any questions in the meantime? Anything you want to throw out there for discussion?
I'll ask one.
Yeah, go ahead.
You set a lot of ambition with your presentation, which I think is absolutely right to set that ambition. And you earmarked routes that we should be going down. Obviously, we're not there yet, and particularly from the government regulatory perspective, whether that is in single countries, EEZ or across the basin. How do you see the progress that is being made relative to the goals and ambitions that you're setting, and what could governments, regulators do to take steps closer to where you see we should be going?
I think we're not speeding up fast enough. And what we see in the Netherlands, for example, with the nature inclusive tender specifications, I think that's really helpful. Just to get the sector involved and get innovation going. And I think other countries can really learn from that. But I also think we should look at it on a bigger scale, on a wider scale. So right now, offshore wind can be seen as an opportunity to really look at nature restoration or recovery or enhancement, or what you want to call it. And to really, well, shake up governments, both national and international, and say, hey, we're putting a lot of pressure on the system. And with everything, we also have to look at how to either make the pressure smaller or to offset it. So I think this can be a wake-up call, so to say. And I think in the end, we should go towards some sort of fund where it's obligatory that anything you do in the sea, you have to have a certain percentage put in a fund. And then a governmental body or anything overseeing that fund can say, okay, this is where we're going to put it, where it's most useful in restoring or offsetting and really enhancing nature and really bringing the system back up to a higher level.
Okay. I'd push back a little bit on the, I think it's perfectly reasonable to say we should be doing things faster, better. From my experience working within government and working with in collaboration with industry, with NGOs across government, the pace in terms of the ambition to deliver, and their problems are coming up, and nation arts being one of them. We can't have our foot any further on the gas, partly because of the resource side of things in terms of people power across the board. And then you've got, historically, I guess traditionally from a government regulatory perspective, government is always quite risk averse. And in terms of the route to progress, you need, at whatever level of government in this deal with its legal department, you need to have some assurance that you're not going to take too much of a jump and therefore kind of get tripped up by a judicial review or whatever.
Yeah.
So there's various factors I was back, resource being one of them, and that's a barrier that's been addressed both by government and by industry. But even then, it still remains one of the greatest risks. So it's a challenge again. What can we do?
Yeah, and it is a challenge because, well, in the end, if we want to scale up at the pace we're scaling up right now, current nature legislation is going to stop the outgrowth of wind and sea, right? And that's not where we want to go, because we all know that we need sustainable energy, and when we want to do it in a sustainable way. But I also think that there are possibilities in speeding up as well, because it is possible to put out an industry as fast as it's going. Then it's also possible to look at the nature restoration and protection side of it. In the Netherlands, we've been thinking about protected areas for over 30 years. And right now, on the North Sea floor, 0.3% is protected. It's nothing. So why can we have this enormous industry and nature is just some sort of side issue? But I think we can speed it up. And also, of course, Europe is helping with that, with the nature restoration law, for example, and biodiversity incentives. And I think that if you can couple it on some sort of level, saying industry and nature shouldn't be seen loose or apart from each other, then there's your biggest opportunity. And of course, there will be bumps in the road, and it will go slower than I want it to go, because that's always the case. But I still see, or I'm still quite optimistic to see the industry being sort of a catalyst to really make nature restoration and nature protection bigger than it used to be.
I just wanted to add a kind of small point as well, really. So I think there's a lot of strategic kind of long-term discussion, but on the short term, I think what the presentation also highlighted is that we're coming up with new technology that needs to be piloted, tested and demonstrated it actually works. And most of the licenses out there, say for wind farms or for pilot sites, is relatively restricted. So it would say, oh, this wind farm needs to use granite rock from this quarry to this specification. So if you want to test something, you can't just put it there. And well, we actually have a test site on the River Crouch in the North Sea near Gunfleet Sands, and we're looking to get different test sites as well. But it's always time-consuming and costly in order to get these test sites. And I know there is the Catapult site, and we're collaborating with Catapult on test sites where we can do our tests. But some of these test sites are still costly because they're not always operated by Catapult. Sometimes they're operated by other people. And I guess on the short term, we're going to take home, perhaps for you, as a representative of the MMO, it's to support the industry, particularly my industry, to have more easier access to test sites, so we can actually gather the evidence that we need, so that we can kind of keep speed up and such.
Yeah, so no, that's direct to me, and I know the reasons behind that. So I absolutely agree with you. I think I've got to be careful about what I say, but the ambition to get in a position that Holland are in terms of being able to deliver test sites is there. And I know that personally, within the MMO, there is a difference between having the ambition and the authority to do that. Previous project that I was working on with the MMO, we were trying to do something very similar, and you've been more successful than we have.
Yeah.
So yeah, we can pick that up offline, if you like.
Yeah, sure. It's I guess you have the long-term vision, which seems to be a massive objective that is kind of relatively intangible, and then kind of short-term goals as well, and maybe short-term wins. So let's talk about that later on. We have a question from Anna online.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to go back to the point of optimizing scour protection to bring it as closer as possible to natural hard substrate. And we talked about optimizing the shape and material of the elements we use to maximize biodiversity. But I think something important here is to understand that the shapes and weights of all those elements are already optimized. They are just optimized for something different, like to protect the pile and make it safe. So I think it'd be great to figure out how to make the two teams that are working almost in parallel work together. We have a team trying to optimize for biodiversity, one team trying to optimize for scour protection. Working together from the get-go, for me, it's the tougher challenge. To create a team that's really multidisciplinary from the start. I'm totally open to ideas on how to make that happen and be more effective to maximize resources in a way and not be monitoring for two different things totally separated, but just build a system that works for both things from the get-go. Something interesting is I'm not sure how many scour design engineers are here today. And at the end of the day, they might be people who take the legal responsibility on this system. So having them here from the beginning would be awesome. And this has been a super helpful presentation. Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you. I would say put an ecologist on every team. That really helps. But I think being aware of this is a really great first step. So yeah, I think we're on the right path right now, and we also have to figure it out, right? It's different from what we've had so far. So yeah.
I think the question or the statement is exemplary of why we're here. You know, looking to collaborate across the region, across the North Sea, also across industry, and across the different sectors between contractors, engineers, and universities, academics, and ecologists, and so forth. So yeah, I think the kind of one take-home point today is that we really encourage that collaboration, and this project is very much open. We're very much open to that. So yeah, please get in touch, and we can see how many resources we can allocate to that, and perhaps other people will want to join on that as well. And yeah, come to that point, getting engineers to work with ecologists, to work with the designers for the artificial scour protection. So it's 1:15 now. Hopefully that answers your question, and I suggest that we all break off for 15 minutes, and we'll be back at 2:30. Thank you so much for your attention this morning, and we'll be back shortly.
Welcome back, everyone, to this afternoon's session. It was a very good session this morning. It gave rise to lots of interesting discussion on the topics of who's responsible for biodiversity recovery in the North Sea, how we might do it, various policies and legislative and other barriers to biodiversity recovery in the North Sea. In this next session, we will be looking at ways in which we might explore biodiversity recovery, biodiversity patterns, differences in biodiversity in projects that would have an aim or an objective to have biological or biodiversity enhancement linked to scour protection or other engineered substrates and materials that we might use for defence of some kind. I'm going to start off this session with a few of the questions that you've seen earlier on Menti. So you're still on that and you're logged in via your phones. If you could start with this first question. Which of the following is likely to have the biggest impact on community structure of an artificial reef? How long it has been there, the type of concrete or material that it's made out of. This is an interesting one. The time of year that the reef was submerged, will that make a difference, or the biggest difference, or the depth at which the reef is placed, the artificial structure is placed?
Can everybody still access Menti? No. Will, could you assist with finding the Menti?
Maybe we need to start it
Put it
again.
back on the screen.
Okay, one person for the product type, that the concrete. And anybody want to comment on that? Does anyone want to?
I want to comment on it.
All right, Alex, fire away.
Depends on the spatial temporal scale you measure it over and the context of what you mean by biggest.
Fire away, explain, unpack that.
Well, at what time point are you measuring community structure from any of these options? At what spatial scale are you measuring biodiversity structure over, given that it scales with space?
Yeah.
And what is the context of biggest?
Yes.
Up, down, left, right, changing connectivity?
Yeah.
You know.
So richness versus functions versus beta diversity versus other things. Yes. So we get into some of the research questions. We're probably now getting into some of the things that are of most interest to the people that are presenting in the next session from their research field, but absolutely the context of how the questions.
It may be worth saying, I can put these questions together. They're not necessarily, you don't necessarily have correct answers. And I didn't think of all those points. Those are the two things I say on that.
Okay, fair enough. But I still think it's important to think about, absolutely. Expectations matter in a project, particularly if it's linked to industry. And if you're measuring something too early, you're not looking at the potential full suite of biodiversity, or even, and I hasten to use this word, but it's appropriate to use in this audience, some sort of what would be the equilibrium biodiversity in that system, if you measure it too early. And so it's important to think about what are the horizons for your expectations. Doing a project and measuring it in 6 months may be entirely inappropriate. Likewise, measuring it in winter might be entirely inappropriate if peak biodiversity is always seasonally in late summer. So these are really good kind of ideas that we need to think about. Okay, going on to the next question. Which of the following is likely to have the biggest impact on measuring community structure on an artificial reef? The visibility of that biodiversity or the water in which you're working, how long you spend and the effort you put into your survey, timing of the survey, timing being during the day, things that you don't take account of by going at the same time, or time of the year. Most people going for the time of the year, we just touched on that about seasonal differences. Anyone who wanted to mention anything about effort or the duration of the survey, of any experiences that they've maybe had? Anyone online that wants to talk to that? Yes, yeah,
it really depends on the method of monitoring. So if you're using an ROV, then visibility, of course, is very important. But if you're using EDA, then visibility doesn't matter at all. I think the consequent factor in this would be the time of the year, because it's something that's consequent over time. But it really depends on your method.
I think that's true. The context, there's lots of context in this question, more than most there. Absolutely. Okay, we'll move on to the next one. Some methods, not all methods, but some methods here, survey methods. Which of these are you happy that are most likely or is likely to identify the most species of fish using an artificial reef? So specifically looking at mobile consumers, mobile predators. Not a lot of love. Well, there's more love for scuba diving. Anyone who's got love for scuba diving in the North Sea likes taking risks. John and his team tries to use scuba diving for one of our projects. I can't remember what the visibility is, but he was doing this at the time. Anyone else? Baited remote underwater video seems to be winning. Anyone got experiences of that? Anyone joining us online got projects that use BRUVs? There's a lot of love for BRUVs if you look across social media and people. It's a very, obviously it's very visual. You've got recorded video. People like to put it on social media. Anyone got experience using them? Rick, have you tried using these yet?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about it.
You're going to talk about it, so we'll not ask you about it. In that case, I won't continue talking about it because I could spoil some of the
No,
fun.
you can do.
Well, you're just going to see, I think it's very difficult to think about using non-baited bruvs, and non-baited traps, non-baited things when we think about biodiversity, because the risk is you don't get anything. The other side of that is that you get different things, and it's not got the biases towards things that would come to bait. But certainly drop down and baited seems to be very popular at the moment. Okay. Okay, so you're working on fish diversity and you want to know how long do you think this needs to be in sampling, remote unmanned vehicle? How long does it need to be there to ensure a good estimate of fish diversity? How long do you think it is? This is probably something that maybe an answer is going to be revealed so I definitely not. No definitive answer. Classic science. Not quite full answer. Certainly everyone's going for the hours. I would have said that. I would have gone. I think I might have gone for lots of hours. Okay, I'm going to move on. And I think we're going to have more time for questions at the end of both of the presentations that are about to come up. The first of which will start to tackle some of the questions that we've just looked at. So think about the answers that you gave, and you might see some comments related to that in the presentation we're about to have. After that, we'll have a presentation from Professor Alex Dumbrell here at Essex University, looking at different monitoring methods. But we start off and very much welcome Professor Rick Stafford, who's joining us today from Bournemouth University. Thanks for making the travel, Rick. And he's going to be speaking to us about specifically visual monitoring of benthic and fish communities in marine environments. Rick, over to you.
Thanks. Firstly, I kind of forgot this was going to be partly online, so this isn't interference, this is a genuine shirt. I apologise about that. And if you didn't pick up what I was saying before, so the questions are things I put together, which some of those will be addressed in this talk, but there isn't necessarily a right or wrong answer for any of this either. So there's two parts to this. Firstly, methods of visually monitoring benthic and fish communities, and secondly, some of the sort of environmental influences that might actually be changing those communities. And you can probably see down here, minimize that a second, but this is, so most of what I'm talking about comes from one of two projects which we're working on at the moment. What you can see on this slide is a 3D printed concrete block, which is part of our 3D pair project, which was an Interreg funded project, which is coming to an end early next year. So this is in the UK. It's relatively shallow. They're about sort of 6 meters. We do have replicates of these across the west coast of Europe as well. So I will show you some of the results from that. And I've got another project which is much nicer to scuba dive on because it's also in Bali, and I'll show you some of the results from that as well. So that's where most of what I will talk about and most of where the results have come from. Okay, so different visual monitoring measures you can probably see here. We've got things like, well, most obvious one, scuba diving. This is the Bali Artificial Reef project, which I'm working on with a PhD student at the moment. Most people know about scuba diving. Basically, you swim around and you look at things. You can go up close, you can look at things closely, you can take quadrats if you want to, you can use various other methods, but it's very sort of visual, and you swim around and you look at things. And it's much nicer in the tropics than it is in the North Sea. This on the, I don't know what people can see, so I'll try using the cursor instead. This here is a stereo bruv unit. A stereo bruv compared to a normal bruv, but they're kind of similar. The stereo basically has two cameras which point slightly inwards to each other. And if you really want to, it's quite a lot of extra work, you can also then work out things like the size of the fish, and there's ways to do that. You can estimate that up to biomass of fish as well. And then we've got various remote operated vehicles. And this is Sam, who's one of the research assistants, desperately trying to fix one of our remote operated vehicles. And I think that's where we spent most of our time with this on the project, is trying to fix it and trying to make it actually submerge once it goes in the water. But there are different advantages and disadvantages of these methods. They do slightly different things. I've combined here RUV, which is baited remote underwater video, and RUV, which is just remote underwater video without bait. There are some slight differences to those, which I'll talk about as well, with just remote operated vehicles and with scuba diving, just to sort of give you a comparison of what you find. So once you drop down a RUV unit, until you pull it up and move it, it's basically in a fixed location. It needs to be moved manually. You need to go back to it, either pull it up, or you can, if it's relatively shallow, also move them with divers as well, which are one of the things we've done before. Whereas remote operated vehicles or scuba obviously are mobile to some extent. You can survey a much wider area within a particular time frame if you're using those techniques. RUV units are relatively cheap to make and use, particularly mono RUVs. You basically need a good camera which can go underwater. Most of the GoPros and similar things will go down to, with a good waterproof case, go down to about 30 meters, which is probably fine in most cases. They go on an aluminium frame, or you can use bamboo frames and things if you're in the tropics. Just need a weight on them and they sink. So it's relatively cheap to make, relatively easy to deploy, relatively easy to use. And we've had students deploy these on things like paddle boards. You can swim them out if you like. So, they can be relatively easy. You don't necessarily need boats. Those remote operated vehicles, generally much more expensive, depending on the size. But yeah, they certainly cost a lot of money to use one of those. Scuba diving, particularly again in the UK, has become really expensive as a monitoring technique, because we're now back under HSE regulation, where divers will need to be commercial scuba or Part 4 or whatever the sort of final version of that's called. It needs quite a big operation. It ends up being very expensive to do that. We have very sort of unreliable size information for most things. So if you want to know the size of mobile fauna which we're seeing, the only real option to determine that accurately would be stereo RUV. Obviously, with something like diving, you can probably see if there's a big or a small fish, but it does fall a little bit under that sort of fisherman's thing of it was that big. And as probably most people know, you also see things bigger if you're wearing a mask. So it's not, it's going to be limited. So deploying things like RUV or RUV can be quite easy, but actually the analysis of it tends to be quite time consuming. So for something like an hour-long deployment video, you're probably looking for somebody with considerable experience spending at least sort of 4 hours analysing that to get the data you need out of it. It's going to take quite a long time. And that's if you know what the majority of those species are. The first time you would do something like that, it's going to take you about 12 hours for an hour. It does get quicker. Of course, remote operated vehicle with a camera is going to have exactly the same issues. It's going to take the same amount of time to analyse that, whereas scuba diving potentially could be a lot quicker. You could be making notes while you're underwater. You can basically come up with those notes. It's much quicker to put into some sort of spreadsheet or something like that. So the analysis side of it can also be a lot quicker. With a camera, you've obviously got a fixed field of view, probably something like 30 to 45 degrees, depending on that camera. You can't see anything that's happening around the side of that. Whereas with scuba diving, you can obviously look around, you can see everything that's happening all around you. So you actually can take in probably a lot more information from that. And the kind of data that you get, so from a video feed, we tend to record, firstly, the maximum number of species which you'll see over that course of time, which will be your measure of diversity. And then you'll pick up something, what we normally use is something called max N. And this is almost certainly an underestimate of the number of individuals that you see. It's basically the maximum number of individuals you can see in a field of view at any one time. So if you see 2 pollocks swim past your camera, your current at that time, that max N is 2. If later on 5 swim past, your max N becomes 5. Okay. If another 4 swim past, quite quick succession after those 5, you don't add them together to get 9, because potentially they could have swum around the camera, come back again. The odds are you're underestimating, but at least you're not overestimating the number of individuals using that technique. So again, those would apply for anything which has a video. For scuba, can't really see what's in a particular field of view necessarily at any time. So you can, in some cases, get count data of things. You can certainly get percentage cover data of benthic organisms, or estimates of percentage cover data. But there's also things like, just felt wrong on that, but there is things like SACFOR as well. So essentially ordinal data. So super abundant, you know, it depends roughly how many fish you see. So if you're seeing 10 fish of a certain size go past, you might be saying, well, that's quite abundant in this case. You see 100 of them go past, it might be super abundant. So you can score them on that kind of ordinal scale. Realistically, things like RUV and RUV will only really look at mobile communities. So you're not going to be able to pick up the benthic communities on a structure. Probably the same applies to RUV, remote operated vehicles, sorry, ROVs. You can obviously, if you're a really good pilot to one, you've got the right technology, you can move in quite close, you can get good fields of view of what's there. Certainly, if you're trying to sort of determine species of hydroid or species of barnacle or something like that from a video, particularly in poor visibility, you're not really going to get that benthic community. And the only real kind of visual way of doing that, at least, is through scuba diving. There is a difference as well between what you actually find and what species you're likely to see from these different methods. So something like remote underwater video without the bait, you'll tend to capture quite a lot of shy species because you drop it down, okay, everything scatters, but over time, some of those species will begin to come back, they'll begin to behave normally. And that doesn't necessarily happen with an ROV or with scuba. You're more likely to attract curious species that are actually coming up to see what's going on, much less likely to see those shy species, which see somebody and basically swim off as fast as you can. One of the differences as well between baited remote underwater video and non-baited remote underwater video is whether or not you're attracting in species from a wider area. So with bait, it basically puts out various chemical markers in the water. Fish will be attracted to those, and some fish will come towards that bait. So you're more likely to see a fish from a wide range or a wide area, and it can potentially attract fish in from quite a way away. For the work which we've been doing, mainly because lots of things are actually in quite close proximity, which we're trying to look at. So some of our artificial structures and our specially designed artificial reefs are in relatively close proximity, we would certainly be able to encourage a species from one structure to another. So we've been using non-baited for virtually all the work which we've been doing. So how long do you need? This may be the most definitive answer I guess that I've got so far. So probably what you know from basic ecology, even if it's terrestrial ecology, if you go out and put a quadrat down, basically you find more species the more quadrats you put down, the bigger the quadrat that you put down. So a sampling effort basically affects the number of species that you see. So what we can do is we can draw these rarefication curves. So we basically look at species accumulation over time in a video. But what we would normally do is drop down something like a 12 unit. We can give that about 5 minutes just to allow any sort of disturbance from dropping it down to happen. And then you can begin to see how many species come in. You can count your new species. These are what I always used to tell students who actually go into the pub curves, because once you hit this point, you've done enough sampling because it's flattened off. You're not really collecting any new species and it's time to go to the pub. I didn't actually realize for years they were called verification curves, but apparently they are. So we've got different estimates. And so this is data from Indonesia. And we found we're getting about 90% of our species appearing in about 20 minutes of a deployment of a remote underwater video unit, not a baited unit. Within the UK, we started off looking at different sites which are quite a long way apart, and we were using baited underwater video. And a paper which we published last year pretty much determined we could use 30 minutes of time on a baited unit within the UK on relatively shallow rocky reefs. And we get again about 90–95% of the species we were likely to see over that time. So we've now moved to remote underwater video. Yeah, forgotten the R there. Remote underwater video, and we're not baiting that at the moment because we've got things which we want to be able to determine very sort of close spatial proximity. So we're actually going up to a 60-minute time period now in order to get 90% of the species we'd expect to see. There are factors which affect the duration. So firstly, any sort of disturbance. So that's why you need to have that settlement period once you put something in. Visibility is going to affect this. If you've got really poor visibility, you can't really do this. The techniques we're using in the UK basically say we're trying to estimate something within about a 2-meter distance of the camera. So anything which is coming in at about a 2-meter distance of the camera, that is an estimate. One of the things that we do to help that is we actually put the baited stick on there, but without any bait in there, and that will stick out by about 1 meter. So we've got a good sort of visual estimate of how far away some of those fish are. So if somebody's swimming around right in the background, we won't necessarily count it. Clearly, one of the reasons you can use less time in a place like Bali is you've got a lot better visibility. You can see things go past further away. Bait has an effect. It's going to attract predatory fish. It's going to attract fish which are detritivores and things like that. So yeah, you're likely to see more fish if you've got bait, essentially. There's natural diversity between locations. So some locations will have more fish and you're more likely to, if you've got more species of fish, it's probably going to take you longer to see some of those rare species. So there is natural differences between locations. And also things like underwater obstructions can be important. If you're putting these into things like seagrass beds, you've got quite a bit of the area of your video which you can't actually see because it's obstructed some of the time, at least, by seagrass. If it's in seaweed, you get the same sort of situation. And you actually miss some of the species of fish, we think. We've done surveys on seagrass beds, and where you've got patches where there's no seagrass, we're actually finding more things like small dragonet fish. And we don't know if that's actually because they like those patches where there aren't seagrass, or whether we just don't see them because they're crawling around within the seagrass. So some of the results which you get out of this. So here's some of the here's some of the things which you can do with this data. You can obviously look at species richness. So that's your maximum number of species that you find over a certain time period. We can see that there's seasonal trends here. So these are all either natural or artificial reefs down on the south coast in Paul Bay. And there's no real patterns, to be honest, at least in terms of number of species over time. We can see some of these locations have much lower number of species in June and July. Some of them have much higher numbers of species in June and July. You also look at typical sort of max N, so how many individuals you begin to see in some of these reefs. And this does vary, and it does vary over time, but it tends to be obviously be very dominated by very abundant species. So I think it was bib, particularly in this survey, which we found a lot of on in different locations, and they seem to move between some of those locations at different times of year. We can also look at multivariate analysis, and you can begin to see whether or not there are sort of clusters which relate to certain types of reefs. So here, all the green dots on this slide are natural reefs, and all the grey dots are artificial reefs. You can begin to see a slight split between those, and it may well be things like black green, in this case, probably were more abundant on the artificial reefs at that particular stage, whereas things like bib were probably more present on the natural reefs over that year of sampling, essentially. So you can begin to see that sort of split in community structure.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Are these artificial reefs designed to be a reef, or are they just random hard substrates?
Yeah, good point. Poole Bay Artificial Reef was set up to be an artificial reef. It was set up about 10 years ago. The other ones are just artificial structures. So our new 3D printed reefs are right next to this one, which is the training bank, which is basically there to train water out of Poole Harbour, make sure it flows out in the right way. Yeah, so this was mainly set up for lobsters, but actually it's been quite well colonised by all sorts of stuff. But that's the only sort of purpose for artificial reef. But it is quite an old one as well. It's about 10 years old.
And how would you describe the natural reefs?
So these are all in Poole Bay, and we don't actually have that much rocky substrate in Poole Bay. So these tend to be patches of rock with patches of sand in the middle as well. So it's quite, they're certainly not sort of covered in kelp or anything like that. They are, again, between about sort of typically about 8 meters deep, I guess. This artificial reef is actually about 14 meters deep, so it's a little bit deeper than the others as well. But yeah, the natural reef's a very sort of combination of rock and sand. These are the results from our artificial reefs around Europe, and we can see a few things here. So firstly, we've obviously got different diversity in different countries. That's probably not that surprising. We've got different communities which would colonize those reefs in different countries. But location is therefore important. Where we're putting these reefs is important in terms of what colonizers them, and in terms of how well colonized they are in terms of diversity. We can see in some cases there is a seasonal trend in things like diversity. So in the UK, we've probably got a stronger seasonal trend in diversity, where we've got lower diversity in spring, begins to increase through to late summer and autumn. So we don't survey these in the winter. We have enough problems surveying them in March and in like October time. So we don't know what happens in the winter. My guess is presumably diversity increases over the summer, then begins to drop off in the winter. We don't necessarily see those patterns in some of the other countries. They will be slightly, they're seasonal. The France one is actually North France, so it shouldn't be that different to us. It's actually got a much higher diversity, probably than all the other reefs. It's also quite a lot deeper. All these other reefs are sub 10 meters. The France reef is probably about 15 meters in depth. And one of the big differences is it doesn't have that much algal cover on it. Our reefs tend to be covered in algae. Once you get down probably below sort of 10, 15 meters, you get a lot less algae growing on these, which means you can get a lot more space and have a lot more other things growing on them as well. So location's important, and depth will be important in determining what sort of structure you get. There isn't a lot of data on seasonal changes and how, when you would put a reef in, you know, what the early colonization is and what that means for the final structure. So I've tried to pull out a few papers which have addressed this in natural systems, and they've mainly been done in intertidal systems, and how applicable that is to subtidal, I'm not sure. But some studies, so particularly this top one, which was done in the Gulf of Maine, did seem to show that what you end up as a community, whether it's a seaweed dominated community or whether it's a mussel dominated community, can depend on the time of year. So it may depend on sort of recruitment pressure coming in, or propagular pressure and colonization of that area. And these end up as stable states and take a little while to move, or quite a lot of pressure to move between those stable states. Equally, these two studies are both done in Hong Kong, and Hong Kong is a seasonal tropical environment. So it has a very hot winter, a very hot summer, and a very, well, comparatively much cooler winter. So what appears to happen there is the summer die-off in things, particularly in algae, basically kills off everything. It doesn't matter when you have, what colonizes initially, that summer die-off period is so strong that basically you'll end up with the same community over time anyway. I couldn't find any data on that from artificial reefs, so I don't know what those results are. And, you know, obviously there's been a lot of studies at the moment monitoring for around about 2 years in different locations. We're probably not yet at the point when we know what those stable, or we don't really have them within the marine environment, what those climax communities would be. What we do know is, from quite a lot of reviews, that the type of concretes that you use to make an artificial reef will only have a difference over the first few weeks or months. So in initial stages of colonization, you do see different biofilms colonize reefs. But after a couple of months, you basically end up with the same ecological communities. Okay, so it doesn't make a huge amount of difference if you use some of the eco-concrete mixes, bioreceptive concrete mixes. Probably the biggest thing is things like, if you can use a low carbon concrete, it's probably got a better environmental effect. It isn't necessarily going to affect the final structure, which comes up. Over time, we do begin to see perhaps some changes in community structure from artificial reefs, and potentially moving more and more towards natural reefs. There are a huge number of European funded artificial reef projects, which probably started about 3 years ago, and they're all coming to an end now. And they've done about 2 years of monitoring. And the typical thing that they're finding, which pretty much matches what our 3D Pair project is finding, is in most cases, specially designed artificial reefs have a higher biodiversity than your standard artificial structures in the marine environment, but they're probably not as high as your natural reefs. But that's been done after about 2 years. And we don't know what's going to happen in the future, because those communities are still changing. This is data from the tropics. So this is again data from Bali, which is looking at artificial reefs, which are down here in these colors, natural coral reefs, which are up here in these colors, and some sand, which is massively different, as you probably expect in terms of community structure. But the key thing is, the older the artificial reef, so the older the artificial reef community, the closer it's basically moving this way over time. Okay, and these are the coral reefs up here. So it looks like these structures over time becoming more and more associated. This is fish community again. It's becoming more and more associated to be similar to what the natural coral reef is. But some of these have been in about 5 years. These are different years that they've been sampled. So we've got potentially 5 years worth of data. There's only three monitoring periods on there. This seems to be coming closer and closer to a natural coral reef. They're not there yet. We are going to be continuing this for about the next 5 or 6 years. So hopefully we'll be able to give you more figures in about 5 or 6 years. So yeah, just to summarize, visual monitoring techniques all have their advantages and disadvantages. Clearly, you know, in some cases, like wind farms in the North Sea, things like scuba might just be physically or legislatively impossible, so we might not be able to use those. But there are advantages and disadvantages of different techniques. If we did something like ROV monitoring or even ROV monitoring, one of the things we firstly need to do, because it's location specific, is look at those verification curves for those specific sites and those specific locations that we're looking at, and know how long we need to deploy those things. It's likely to be somewhere around an hour, 2 hour kind of mark, I would guess. But that's per replicate as well. So actually, by the time you multiply that up to 3 or 4 replicates, it's going to take a reasonable amount of time to collect that data. From a visual point of view, without diving, we're not going to be able to identify all the benthic species which are present. I think you might be addressing that in a bit. So there may be other ways of doing that. The environmental factors which act on colonisation do seem to be site-specific as well. So it's very hard to necessarily generalise and say depth is going to be the most important factor, because it might depend where you are. It might depend on how much light you can get down there, and that might affect algal growth, for example. And we don't really know seasonal effects at the moment, particularly when a reef is deployed, may be relatively minor in terms of the final community that ends up there. I think there's probably bigger factors which will address that final community which you find. Okay. Are we going straight onto the next?
I think we'll straight on to that. Thank you very much. And those of you joining us online, give us a second till we. So I think you're going straight on to purpose. Yeah. Is that the one? Yep. And if someone on the chat could just confirm that they can see this slide. Anna or Paul. Yeah, here we go.
Hey,
okay.
Thanks,
And over to Alex.
I'll hide this little box here so I can see my own slides.
Okay, thanks, Tom.
So I'm going to talk about biomonitoring. So capturing biological diversity, monitoring biological diversity. There is nothing in here about artificial reefs. There is nothing in here even about sort of subtidal reefs and subtidal systems, and that's done on purpose. What I want to do is talk about the generalizable approach. I tried my best to not even have any marine examples in this, so we can just focus on the approach completely, but I failed miserably because one of the things that I needed to make a point happened to come from an intertidal system. But this is to do with the approaches we can take, and it's looking at sort of an holistic approach to understanding ecosystem responses to change. And we're looking here really at the sort of best practices, or what could be potentially the ultimate best practice, depending if you believe me or not, to biodiversity monitoring. Okay, so I've now got the opposite problem to Rick. There we go. Mouse was working, keyboard wasn't. So a few years ago, we suggested what the vision for the next generation of biomonitoring was going to be. And this is ultimately still not quite a reality, but we're moving there. What we think the world should be moving towards is a system where we have automated samplers placed globally. In this case, offshore samplers, reef samplers. These could be anywhere, terrestrial systems, freshwater systems. And these automated samplers capture samples from the environment. They take out DNA or RNA from that. They then automatically sequence the nucleic acids that have been captured from that environment. They then ping all that data up to some sort of giant cloud server, piggybacking off 5G, 4G networks. And then the data analysis all happens up there on various computers globally. And from that, we start to reconstruct and learn ecological networks. Okay, so this is an automated way of capturing DNA from the environment, using that to identify the species that are present, taking that wealth of data that it then produces, putting it all together, and instead of just using it to describe the number of species, the number of taxa that are present, actually start to resolve the ecological networks they come from. And those networks could be things like food webs, but this could also be interaction networks between functional components of the community, and also things like genomes and genomic networks that underpin the functionality of what's going on. So ultimately, collect and capture, automatically analyze and produce a description of everything that's happening in the system. Now, this is not yet a reality, but every single bit of this can be done. So there are ways to automate DNA extraction. There are ways to send data through remote signals to cloud servers and do the analysis. There are machine learning and AI approaches that can extrapolate and predict and produce ecological networks and define their interactions, whether those interactions be trophic interactions, so predator-prey interactions, or things that are facilitative or competitive, amensalisms, mutualisms, so on and so forth. Yeah? So it all happens, it's just a case of putting it together. Now, I'm not saying that this is what everybody has to do, but anything we can do from a biomonitoring perspective, in my opinion, that moves us closer to this is going to be the best we can possibly do. All right? And here's why I think that. So first of all, why this focus on ecological networks? The picture I've got of an ecological network here happens to be one from an agro ecosystem, and it's just because it looks nice. Doesn't have to worry about where it comes from. It's rather pretty, you've got some beetles and stuff on there. But effectively, what we know is that biological diversity drives ecosystem processes and functions. Yeah, the more diversity they have, generally speaking, the greater the process rates, the greater the functionality of the system. And at the point that asymptote tells us something about the functional redundancy within that system, perhaps some species are doing the same thing as others, so on and so forth. But if we want to take that a step further and evaluate the link to services, then we really start to have to understand the interactions within this network, as well as just the individual species. So I'll give you an example of that. Our function, or our service, sorry, I should say, our service we're interested in could be carbon sequestration. It's a biggie. Everybody wants to know about carbon neutrality at the moment. So carbon sequestration could be our service, or at least carbon neutrality could be our service. Now that's going to be underpinned by a number of different functions. Yeah. Decomposition rates, which themselves scale with biological diversity. Turnover rates of organic matter between different organisms, that again scales with biodiversity. But what they're also scaling with is the links between the different members of the network. Yeah. So if you imagine a large amount of carbon, whatever it is, organic matter goes into a system, it's being decomposed, it's broken down by some big organisms first into smaller chunks, and the fungi take over, and the bacteria take over, and the carbon's being moved through them. Those are interactions. And so if we miss them, we miss that. And so while we've never managed to get our hands around an ability to predict ecosystem services off units of biological diversity, you can predict ecosystem services reasonably, first approximation, of interactions within networks. So that's one reason. The other is these interactions with any ecological network also predict aspects of the stability of the ecological system. So there's a number of different components to ecological stability. My little graph here shows us some of them. So things like variability, how much it fluctuates through time. Persistence, how long it stands in a sort of steady-ish state. Its resistance to change, so how much it stops being forced in one direction from another. And its resilience, that sort of bounce back time to its recovering potential. Now, just as ecosystem functions are determined by both the species and the interactions between them, and some species having greater or lesser effects on certain functions that combined will make up the various services there. This is so true for ecological stability. Different species maximize different components of ecological stability. And again, thinking about them holistically together, how they interact with each other, gives you a greater picture of the multiple dimensionality of stability and how all of that changes. And the final thing to consider when it comes to ecological networks is ecological surprises. This, I am told from a quick Google search, is the surprise emoji. I'm not convinced, and I put it on there thinking I need something that looks surprised, but maybe the hungry emoji. But anyway, this is my thing to represent ecological surprises. What are ecological surprises? These are emergent properties from the data from the ecosystem we're studying that aren't predictable from first principles. We didn't think they were going to happen, or things that wouldn't have happened, or we wouldn't have understood if we hadn't captured the complexity of the ecosystem across levels of organization, across the interactions within the network. So I'm going to give you an example of one of these. It's a freshwater example, but it'll work for this. We've got an algal bloom in a freshwater system. Okay. Most people, what do you immediately think? Big algal bloom, what's causing that? Temperature, something chemical, nutrients, yeah, nutrients. Even Wikipedia says it. Freshwater algal blooms are the result of an excess of nutrients, particularly some phosphates. Generally speaking, that's true. In this case, it's not. What's causing this is the spill of an organophosphate pesticide brought by Rephos, yeah? And it's not causing a direct impact on the algae at all, but what it's actually doing is it's killing the invertebrate layer of the food web. You remove them, the algae are released from the grazing pressures they normally feel, they can increase in abundance, and they proliferate massively.
Yeah.
Not a loading issue.
I would hope give you something fresh to sort of suppress.
It does then.
To think about.
Click on participants. And then find Justin. But he's muted himself now.
Oh, there we go. That's nice. Right. So yeah, in this case, it's an indirect effect that's causing this rather than the nutrient loading we'd normally imagine is happening to drive this. So if we just looked at one aspect of the ecosystem, so measuring algae as our biomonitoring exercise, we could easily conclude something very different than what's going on. But there's more to this than that you might miss if you even stop there. This then starts to feed down to the microbial loop. All these dead invertebrates are adding a new thing to be decomposed. They're interacting with the nitrogen cycle and the carbon cycle there, and we're seeing changes in the properties of those processes that, again, we would have missed if we just focused on one level of the network or one aspect of what's going on. And this is a real world example from the River Kennet when there was a pesticide spill there back a few years ago. So important stuff. We can miss things, we can miss and not see those ecological surprises if we take single taxa approaches, single species, or even a collection of species, rather than considering the ecological network in its entirety. Another sort of example of an ecological surprise, but an emergent property that we might not consider is coming from this example. So this is a rocky intertidal food web. It's not the most well-drawn rocky intertidal food web, but bear with me. Here is your standard sort of suite of things you find in the rocky intertidal zone. So little amphipods and isopods, various bits and pieces, down to the algae, some larger top predators, and right at the top of it is the green shore crab. Yeah, that's the top predator in this particular model ecosystem. All right, so think of a rock pool or something like that. And I want you to consider three stressors that might be affecting this network, right? Warming, eutrophication, and harvesting. Now, harvesting is a bit of a weird one to consider on this because people don't really harvest from rock pool. But let's imagine this as a model of a wider and bigger ecological system where there is harvest pressure on the top predator, to be fishing, something like that, and a number of different interacting stressors. Yeah. If we study this, any one of these species in isolation, we're not going to get the same answer as if we look at all of it. And if we don't consider the full diversity of this system, we're going to miss out on some of the functionality. So here's an example of an experiment we set up using intertidal mesocosms. We've got ambient and warm mesocosms, cross with nutrient enrichment, so with and without an enriched system, and then changes in the size structure of the top predator in those mesocosms. Okay, so we're interacting all these different stressors simultaneously, and the part of the network we were particularly interested in were the microbes. Now, for the purpose of today's talk, the microbial aspect of it isn't particularly here nor there. It's just an example of taking this approach. Now, looking at these first principles, what we see in terms of sort of single metrics of biodiversity, so species richness, species evenness, we see that both warming and nutrient enrichment change microbial diversity, but in the opposite directions. So one of them causes an increase in diversity, one causes a decrease in diversity, and ultimately, if you just looked at the entire data set without considering the separation, then it cancels each other out completely. So we can see this in the real world. Yeah. If you're monitoring any system where there's interacting stressors, there is the propensity for them to cancel each other out if you're taking a single metric, a reduced metric of diversity approach to looking at it, like richness. Because you have as much things going up with one as are coming down with the other, and you get a neutral response. But if you start to tease the path of the data a little bit more, and what we're doing here is sort of pulling apart that network. We've got changes in the abundance on these axes. So either a log fold change decreasing in abundance or increasing in abundance, decreasing in abundance on the X and Y axes respectively, as a function of being cold but with small crabs, cold with big crabs, hot with big crabs, hot with little crabs. And you're seeing different species within the microbial communities being pulled in different directions. We have big warm crab favouring species. We have small warm crab favouring species. Not many things like it cold and with lots of little crabs. And we've got some things that like big crabs in the cold as well. And again, if you take this single taxa, single metric approach, you'll miss that complexity. So there is an influence in this system of top predators interacting with warming and taxon specific effects. So considering all those interacting multiple stresses. So that's the sort of why use network approaches, but why should we use DNA and RNA based approaches? Why use nucleic acids at all? So I just got a little schematic I pulled out from a paper we published this year, just because it's a rather nice picture to sort of go over what I mean by this. And it will work as a starting point. But effectively, what we're talking about here is extracting something from the environment. So that could be filtering water and taking the DNA out of the filtered water. It could be taking soils or sediments or scrapes from the side of pylons out and extracting the DNA from that. It could be taking, this example here happened to be some fecal samples from a deer, but it could be also looking at gut content analysis. It could be the things associated with structures that you've put in there. Some environmental matrix. You pull out the DNA from it or the RNA, and then from that, extract it, and you split it up. What you're doing here is you're now targeting either genomic regions or genes of interest, either things that give you a marker about what's going on taxonomically, or a marker that's going on what's going on functionally, or you're isolating the entire genome and reconstructing that. You make sure you add some form of identifier to your DNA sequences so you know which samples they come from. You sequence the whole lot of it. You split it back up into those samples and you use the identities of those DNA sequences to say what was there and some measure of how many of those sequences per unit taxa as a form of sort of relative abundance to give you some estimate of what's going on in terms of the quantitative nature of the data, and then you put it all back together again. That's the sort of approach I'm talking about. Now, this gives us a number of benefits. One, it provides us a common currency. Yeah, you can apply this globally. You're using exactly the same unit of measure for your species as you are anywhere else. And with the same sampling efforts, and you can deploy things at the same time and so on and so forth. Allows greater sample integration. So historically collected samples, once those databases build, they get bigger, they get better. You've got an ability to generalize by incorporating more data into it, integrating data from multiple projects. You get a wealth of data. It really lends itself to sort of big data approaches and integrating across studies. It's highly scalable. And this might be one of the sort of key things. If you're going to go really massive in terms of sampling efforts, this becomes far more cheap per unit sample than if you took a laborious process of having somebody do something. Yeah. But at the bottom end, you might argue that it's not. 2 or 3 samples, it might be far too costly, but other way, it's highly scalable. Captures cryptic species. So, I mean, Rick, you made a point about this earlier. It's not just the things you can see, it is the things that have been there at some stage that have left some sort of genetic evidence behind of their existence. It captures the full wealth of biodiversity. And by what I mean by that is we are getting genetic variation, functional variation, taxonomic variation, the entirety of biodiversity, not just this is what I think a species is. There's a generalizable sampling approach, which means once you've got people trained up, they don't have to need system-specific expertise to do this. So the people that we have diving in Indonesia would be different to the people we might have diving in the UK in terms of their knowledge of the systems for sampling and identifying species of fish. Although fish aren't such a hyper-diverse group that they might still be all right, but you get my point. This is something that as long as somebody knows how to do it once, they can do it multiple times. Less disturbance, potentially, in the way you sample, potentially not. And it reduces the routine need for taxonomic experts. Now, you do require some taxonomic expertise to identify things from DNA sequences, but that sort of becomes a job in itself for the museum specialists who say this species is X, here's its DNA sequence, it's now in a database, and we can then cross-compare against it. What I mean by this is we don't need anybody going into the field, doesn't need to have taxonomic expertise of the thing they're targeting. Yeah. But as with everything, there is a huge wealth of pitfalls and challenges to getting this done properly. So, sample collection in itself, you've got biases coming in from undersampling, contamination from pests and neighbouring events, experimental contamination within the eDNA sort of systems. You're just extracting freely available environmental DNA. You're going to have issues to do with where it was released in water compared to where you detected it. I was thinking about the point you made about visibility. Yeah. So we've got a bias in visibility when we're looking at visual surveys. Yeah, really cloudy water, we can't see as far as non-cloudy water. But the cloudiness in that water, if that's caused by over-sedimentation, especially heavy clay sediments, then you've got something that binds to freely available DNA and preserves it for a longer duration in the environment than if it was in an openly visual system. So, different areas. Now there's controls you can bring into that to do with how you target the taxa you're interested in on any given sampling approach. You might want to build up local reference databases. So once you know what's there, you might take loads of samples of the system, extract the whole thing together, get a really good database to feel what's going against, and then you've got a good cross-referencing to help you go forward. Lots of biological replicates, lots of field negative controls. Now, this bit I'm going to come back to quite a bit. And this is basic ecological sampling and how it is abused and misused across a wealth of studies in this. And it's the sort of thing where you can read some wonderful molecular studies where they've got the high-end molecular wizardry down to a T, but then they haven't randomly sampled the environment or some other thing like that. They haven't looked at their temporal accumulation curves to see if they've saturated or not. It's an amazing sort of issue, but still, we've got issues with the extraction. Yeah, so that extraction might be some extraction efficiencies, undersampling, taxon-specific inefficiencies. So if you've got a whole big sample in there and you've got some really hard-bodied, tough-celled organisms versus stuff that's already freely available, one stuff extracts more rapidly than the other, you might need to look at that. There could be contamination coming in. There's a wonderful thing you can do as an examination of if you take freely available data on newly discovered fungal strains globally, and there's a wealth of fungal strains that are identified as effectively, this is a new one, this is a new one. They're not, they're all lab contaminants from dust fungi that happen in the particular exams that I'm not naming anyone on this one, but there are, you can see this, there are contaminations coming into labs that cause these issues. So again, we can get around that through technical replication, extraction, negative controls, using positive controls, good practice stuff. There's inefficiencies and bias within the amplification steps if we're targeting particular genes. And we might be opening ourselves, producing chimeric properties and not necessarily capturing everything with the primers we use, but again, we can get around this with technical replicates, negative controls, positive controls, multiple primer sets, so on and so forth. So there's a lot of focus here. It might sound a bit repetitive on replication at every level, but it's all sort of good scientific practice. A few issues that might emerge when you've got them on the sequencers to do with tag jumps and sequencing errors, but those can largely be removed bioinformatically and through using appropriate controls. And then we've got this downstream stuff. All this DNA you can do something with, but there's a potential here for an inappropriate. In fact, I'm just going to sort of say what I thought of this. So when we wrote this paper, I wrote an extra 3 pages that never found it into it on the bioinformatics side of things, because I felt that was where the biggest source of errors were coming in. And there is an inappropriate use of data analytics when it comes to applying it to molecular data currently. Now, some of that is not people's faults in terms of practice. It could be that they are matching things to databases that themselves are incomplete. I did a study a few years ago where I'd identified all the plant species in a soil system from their roots based on DNA sequences. Said, this is what they are. Went to a botany expert and he said, no, they're not. I said, they are. That's what the database says it is. They said, they're misidentified. Those plant species don't exist in the UK. So you sort of, there are issues there. But one of the things I think people need to really pay attention to, though, are the ecological nautics. Yeah, the undersampling, the not looking at spatial, temporal scale dynamics, spatial and temporal scale dependencies, context dependencies, appropriate uses of sampling, size of samples, replication within the field system. The molecular side of this has gotten quite straightforward. And there's been a propensity within the literature when people have used these approaches to move towards getting that nailed, but away from actually doing the ground field work, ecological sampling properly. It's a paper that came out from Ian Dickey's group a few years ago. And he found that 95% of the studies that used eDNA at the time used either subjective sampling methods as opposed to objective sampling methods, inappropriate field methods, failed to provide critical methodological information, and it was actually impossible to replicate any more than 5% of the published studies back in, I can't remember when this paper came out, 2018, 2017, when he did the analysis. So we see these sort of issues. We've got location and determination of plots. This is the percentage here, this 0.5%, 5%, something like that, that were actually done randomly. The rest were either not described, so we can't replicate the study, or just objective, maybe a bit of subjectivity in there as well. You know, we see other sort of examples of this, number of subsamples all over the place, area sampled, either not given, and given that we know that biodiversity scales with space as it does with time, you're ending up issues with scale dependencies, both temporal and spatial here. The other naughty, I believe, that is really persistent within the literature at the moment, analytical naughtiness. So here's just a flow of what you would imagine you need to do in terms of analysing eDNA or any form of environmental sort of DNA from an environmental sample data. Yeah, you've got to do a load of things bioinformatically. You've got quality control it, you multiplex it, cluster it, identify it, look at diversity, look at stats, look at models. If every single one of those steps had only 5 possibilities, you're looking at 390,000 possible ways you could analyse the data. All right. And I can tell you right now, each one of those steps has more than 5 possibilities associated with it. So this is not an exhaustive list. Obviously, this is going to be dependent on the question you're asking and the monitoring you're intending to do. But there's a great potential here for massively mistaking and making mistakes in terms of what you observe and perceive from the data at the end of it. And I just want to go back to the example of the crab mesocosm. Yeah, I've shown you, if we just stuck on those original little metrics of single richness, evenness metrics, yeah, we miss about some of the stuff that's going on. But if we really start to explore it, and instead of taking even an ordination-based approach where we cluster and reduce down the dimensionality of the data into something visually, but actually explore the response and computationally, you can do this now of every single taxon present in the sample, we see that different taxa are responding differently. Don't need to worry about what they're actually doing, but the different colours here are the different treatments. Some things are going up, some things are going down. Some things like big crabs, something like hot areas, cold areas, high nutrients, so on and so forth. And this goes back to my point about the network stuff and incorporating appropriate analysis to get here, because this itself determines functionality. And we can extrapolate from those systems various different functional processes that are going on that are themselves dependent on the stresses being added to them. We see elevations in carbon cycling, issues to do with degradation of starches and so on and so forth that behave in one way, things to do with nitrogen cycling that behave in another way. And if you just stop your analysis at here's species richness, you don't get a full perception of what's going on in the ecological system. There you go.
Thank you very much, Alex. If you want to take a seat for now, I'll come back to both of you when I work out. So this is the one that we are, I believe, my page down. Right. So what we're going to do is we're going to have some questions in it. We've got a few more Menti questions that are kind of like post-presentation questions that I'm going to go through. I'm going to go them quite fast, not stall them very long, and then open the floor here in the room and online for questions. Thank you very much to both of you for taking the time for preparing those presentations. It really, I think the word ambition is what I'd like to carry on from this morning's session into this afternoon's session, about being ambitious about how we might approach biodiversity, and not as well as being ambitious about how we might approach restoration. We've heard a lot of, and I've done them myself, like the cartoons that we have of what the North Sea might look like in the future. And it is very, even if it is a slime mold, it's still a charismatic, colourful thing on a cartoon. And we're looking at these charismatic things. If we fish to something that's a bit easier so that people get behind it. And I think from what Rick is talking about and what Alex is talking about is bringing in that ambition and thinking about beyond species and into communities and functions. And this comes into with what Paul said, Paul, who joined us earlier online, about if we focus too much on species, we might be disappointed in what we end up with. Because of climate change, and also just because of some of the things that were touched on in the talks, which is stochastic species assembly, community assembly processes, even if the environment had not changed and was exactly the same as it was 500 years ago, those processes might mean that when we remove drivers like that are destructive drivers like fishing or effects on the seabed, we might not get the same biodiversity that we once had. And therefore thinking about function and using modern tools to try and capture it might be challenging and ambitious, but it maybe is something we should be doing. So the code for the Menti that is coming up is 5375 6552. That's 5375 6552. No, and that didn't work.
I think it just goes, I think we just got the Q&A session for.
All right, okay, I thought there were some questions afterwards.
No.
No?
Do you know if there's any questions?
No, I think all the questions have happened before.
All right, okay, fine, okay. Well, that's good for time because we only have 6 minutes. So in that case, we're in question time. I'll get that off so that it isn't just displaying someone's name. So yeah, questions, anything that have come up today that anyone wants to ask, anyone online. I'll put your participant box up so I can see if you've raised your hand. Any questions about what you've seen, about challenges from biodiversity monitoring, or anything that you'd like to ask about the kind of methods and bottlenecks that have been discussed? John, in the room.
Yeah, so Alex, how fast do you think that process takes? Just go back to your first slide about sort of having monitoring stations in the ocean, being up to the cloud, giving you answers directly. How fast? And then how does that marry up with what Lee was saying earlier actually, when you weren't here, actually, that she has a sort of vision of, you know, action happening quickly, and we're moving too slow to actually respond to what we're learning from wild monitoring.
I'm with you on that one, to ask a good question. Sort of flippant answer is depends how much money you give us. But in seriousness, taking a sample, extracting the DNA from it, and sequencing it could hypothetically be done in a 24-hour period. Yeah. So, best case scenario. And we're talking about robotic things here, as opposed to, I'm not saying to anybody, don't before, given that there's strike day tomorrow, but I'm not saying we should have postdocs working 24 hours a day in labs to get data out. But yeah, you could potentially do that in a 24-hour period in terms of how much the machines work. If you get that automated, those robotic systems can work, yeah? And that's still where we want to be. The components of those robotic systems exist. Can we bolt them all together? Then you've got a 24-hour period. When it goes up to the cloud, depending on how much, the analysis we're talking about here, John, is massively parallelizable. Yeah. So again, depending on the computer resources you've got available to you, you could easily get that turned around within the next sort of day or so. And then the learning of those networks, some of the more recent algorithms that people have got working on them have been finely coded appropriately and coded by people who know how to. There's been some effort put into coding it by a dedicated coder as opposed to the statistician to optimize the speed at which they work as opposed to the robustness of it, which has been done previously. Again, you're probably looking at, depending on the data set, somewhere between half a day and 3 days worth of processing time. So potentially you could get your signal from a sample in a system within 3 to 4 days. Now, that might sound, you know, a bit slow, a bit fast, depends on your perspective, it depends on what you're normally used to sampling. But the idea with that is that you have an array of these systems. And if all of them are working simultaneously, it's not you're getting 4 days for sample 1 and then another 4 days for sample 2, so 8 days, so on and so forth. They're all working simultaneously. And as long as the computation power is there to process it, that's fine, that should work. So that vision is 3 to 4 days, you're really doing a big, large scale stuff. At the moment, though, there are gaps in it. We don't have the automated samples perfected yet. We don't necessarily have, we've got pretty much now in the last year or so, we've nailed the telecommunications aspect to get the data moving around appropriately, and there's been recent versions of the network building out. So it's just that last technological bit. But if you remove that and you do it manually, somebody sampling it, as long as they get enough samples and you've got a lab set up for high throughput, you might just only add an extra week on, which that could be a week for 1,000 samples or 2,000 samples. Whereas if you had one person looking through data or picking out particular, through a sample where they're picking out, I don't know, all the amphipods or something like this, it could take them, they can't parallelize it. Yeah, so that scalability is lacking. So I know that's a bit of a sort of long-winded answer to your question, but I wanted to get completeness in.
So how does that sort of marry up with our ability to do anything about it? So great, you know, we know that the ecosystem is changing within like 3 or 4 days, but if it takes months or years to actually put in policy change in place, I'm not asking for an answer.
I was going to say, I'm totally the wrong person to ask you. I work on data, on biodiversity monitoring and molecular wizardry. So
it's a good question to the floor, and we kind of addressed it earlier. But so let's open that question to the floor and everyone at home. That, you know, what are the challenges of, have we now or are very close to breaking the bottleneck of biomonitoring, where actually the limit is no longer data? And I mean, I think all of us, you know, with a good long hard look at each other, we'd go, we've got quite a lot of data now. I think that might be part of your point that you made earlier, that now that we have the data, we've looked at it, we know that some of these phenomena can work. What do we do with it? I think there's a question within that to come back to, but let me open to the floor. How do we make sure that data helps policymakers? I'm sorry to look at the other one in the room, but helps policymakers to think about innovative ways to get over these barriers. So
you need adaptive management in place, really, don't you? So your policy has to be for adaptive management, then you can make those decisions.
It's literally what we were talking about. Coffee break.
I mean, I've got a question on that, right? Which is, So given that quite often policy is not being driven by people it's being driven by the recommendations that the people involved in sampling, in the industry, the academics make, as opposed to actually the person making the policy knowing really what's going on here, is how long would a policymaker need to see data coming in for before they're confident enough to push for change? So just think of John's point, we could detect change in 3 days and say, right, it's changed. But would that one sample point in 3 days be enough to make anyone go, "Hang on"?
That's a good point. Let's have, you talked about the concept of risk. Maybe you can elaborate on that.
I can't give you an answer to that. I can only say that in terms of decision making, it isn't just one policy maker that needs that assurance. It's SNCBs, it's definitely departmental and ministerial point of view, and it's the regulator from that side of things. And it's, I guess, partly that the processes and the kind of the policy ecosystem, if you will, that takes time to assimilate new information and act on that. And it's difficult to say, you know, what level we need, or, you know, what we need to change it, because I don't think there's a definitive answer. It's the threshold in terms of delivering change for what, you know, for being ambitious is too high, you know, as illustrated by Eleni earlier. But I'm not in a position to articulate what either
would get us to that position. Maybe I can help, because I can understand you might be being cautious yourself in a recorded meeting.
Ganged up on you.
And well, let me give you an example of what might be a reason. Is that we do all these scientific papers, and we've seen lots presented today, and Rick and Alex has presented lots to us. But I guess I would say that the research side of the people in the meeting, and this goes to it doesn't have to be university associated research, it can be NGO and all sorts of users. Think about how best to achieve that change, and it isn't always a scientific paper. And I'll give you an example of that. One of the UK regulators had a very specific question about how to define a habitat. And if you go online, there is loads of information on how to define this marine habitat. And surely you would say that someone from within that regulatory body could sit down and do a meta-analysis of all that and come up with it. But they are not costed to do that, and they're not allowed to do that, because it must be independent, because they are the decision maker. And so despite the fact that all that literature exists, they needed someone else to do that piece of work and say, forget about the scientific paper. Here is a report that doesn't answer the question, how do biogenic reefs with a given set of species classify as being that biogenic reef? How do we know it's a biogenic reef? It wasn't as general as that. It's very specific. In this place, how do you define this habitat when the dominant member of the biogenic reef is native oyster? And that report allowed them to make the decision, because it very specifically answered the question, which was the bottleneck, that sometimes, despite the fact that we've got all this research and all these ideas, they actually aren't able to act on that because it's too big a body of work. And that's where working together, NGOs, academia, and industry, where we do have these bottlenecks, we maybe need to think about being more specific and helping regulators get to the place where they have the confidence to make decisions, because it reduces that risk. We're going to move on because we're going to have a break. I'm sure there's lots we could talk about, all sorts of things that come out of that, from whether species-based conservation is dead in the water and we should move on to function, or which a lot of organizations are now doing, and all these different exciting methods. So it's those of you that are joining us online, I think these slides should be able to be made available for sharing, and if you've got any questions for Rick or Alex afterwards about methods or getting them involved in your projects, then please do get in touch. We'll speak to you after the break, which is in 10 minutes time. Thanks.
Okay, so welcome back, everyone. This is our last session. Can someone online just confirm that they can hear me okay? Yeah, okay, that sounds good. What I would just say is that after this final talk, we have allocated a fair amount of time for some open discussion. So if anyone online still got questions regarding biodiversity or scour protection in the North Sea, then there's still an opportunity to ask those questions after this talk, which is bringing us back to the Living Windfarms project specifically, and talking about how we can achieve mass deployment, and also talk a little bit about our approach to designing eco-reefs and the aims that we're trying to meet.
On the screen first, click on the screen first, and then use page down.
There we go. Okay, I've moved on in the end. So you can see that with our concepts, we're trying to bring together a lot of different aspects. So firstly, we're looking at how can we enhance habitats in these scour solutions. So how can we incorporate features like holes, surface textures and crevices? And this is something that can be particularly challenging when looking at scaling up production, to be able to incorporate those features in an efficient, productive way. The other thing we need to make sure that we're doing is we're achieving the aims from an infrastructure point of view. So in this instance, are we actually providing the scour protection that the units are designed to achieve? Next, we need to ensure that they can be deployed on scale. I talked about some of the reasons behind that in the talk a little bit earlier. And then we need to look at scaling up productivity to bring down the cost per unit. So when you bring all this down together, we have a viable solution that facilitates habitat creation, protects against scour, and be deployed at a commercially viable scale and can be produced in a cheap enough method that it's accessible. So with all of these factors that we're trying to juggle, it'd be interesting for us to find out from a wind farm perspective, which of these factors you think would be the most important as a starting point. So I'll just give you a couple of minutes to put in your answers and submit them. Like the fact that straight away we got a very high importance for biodiversity impact. Yes, I think what comes out here is the starting point from an infrastructure point of view has to be the scour protection. And therefore we need to work out a way that things such as biodiversity impact comes from a sort of nice to have element into a must have element. And if that's not necessarily coming from an offshore wind industry point of view, then maybe that can come from a regulatory point of view, or maybe some kind of like financial means to encourage that. So as you can see, we're trying to balance a lot of different design priorities. And what we're really trying to do is find an effective middle ground between the mass deployment of quarried rock and the singular deployment of really complicated and effective artificial reefs that are really good for boosting biodiversity. So on the one hand, with quarried rock, it's a proven technology. Everyone knows that it works. It provides a scour protection that it's designed to do. It's really low cost and it's time efficient to produce, transport and deploy. But you are not getting the same biodiversity benefit for some of the reasons that Elaine mentioned in her talk earlier. And this obviously also has implications for ecosystem services as well. But on the other hand, you might have these very expensive and brilliant artificial reefs. But if we can't deploy them at a scale and we can't use that proven technology, then there's a barrier there. So if we can bring them together and use those existing technologies in our Eco-Reef designs, then we should be onto a winner where we can deploy these at a large scale but still have that biodiversity benefit. So when tackling biodiversity and thinking about biocolonization, when we're producing these units, we've got to think about several different things. And these have trade-offs in how cost-effective they are to produce as well. So for example, incorporating holes and crevices, that can sometimes be a challenge to apply at a large scale. Another trade-off that we have is looking at porous surfaces or solid surfaces. A porous surface might facilitate biocolonization, but it might have implications in terms of the strength of the unit compared to a solid surface. So these are all the different things that we're trying to weigh up when coming up with these concepts. So yeah, some of you already started, but if you just fill in the how you would assume that these different surfaces would impact biocolonization. I'd probably say that I'm not the most qualified person in the room to be analysing these results possibly, but I think that the things come up and it's a mixture of having those textured surfaces to facilitate the growth of sessile organisms and sort of the macro features such as holes and crevices obviously hugely important in terms of mobile species and providing shelter for those species. So now I've talked a little bit about how we come up with our concepts. I'm going to talk a bit about how we then developed that product from that point onwards. So once we have our concept, our next port of call is to look at some lab testing and some modelling. So for the lab testing, this would be using flume experiments, for example, to see if they do the job that they're meant to in terms of providing scour protection. And we'll also do modelling looking at the strength of the unit as well to ensure that it can withstand the stresses associated with deployment. Once we're happy with that, then we will produce a prototype and make some refinements. And the prototype testing is a really important way for us to look at how viable it is to scale up production. So we might have developed a wonderful concept, really good biodiversity, but we can't scale it up. So we can then make those refinements to keep those features that make it good for biodiversity, but also scalable in production. And once we have all that, we can then move on to do pilot studies to see how they behave in the real world, and also look at real world biodiversity monitoring as well. So going into a little bit more detail about some of the flume experiments that we've done with the University of Southampton. What we're really looking to find out is investigating the scour of the sand around the Eco-Reef units in clear water and live bed conditions. And what we found is that the Eco-Reefs attain an equilibrium very quickly, less than 3 hours in this case. And that following the initial deployment, there is some scour obviously around the unit, but this then stabilizes and these units then act as shelter, reducing the flow downdrift from where the units are sat. We also found that these Eco-Reef spheres become partially buried, and this actually helps to stabilize them as well. So overall, in a nutshell, these results are hugely promising when looking at the scour protection that these units can provide. So now I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about potential loading methods and deployment methods, as well as looking at the strength testing that we're doing as part of this Living Windfarms project. So as I've said a few times now, the main emphasis is looking at scalability and the mass loading and deployment. And what we really want to use is conventional methods where possible to try and ease that transition into using these more nature-based solutions. So some of the options that we've been looking at are conveyor systems, grabs and front loaders. And with these systems, like large quantities can be moved from the shore into the vessel, but there is a certain degree of impact that happens when there's these large drops into the hull of the ship. And therefore alternatives might be things like bulk bags where large quantities can be lowered into the hull, and mattresses as well, where a lot of these units can be tied together and then transported that way. Obviously, this is very dependent on costs and what facilities are available at these portside locations, and also the scale of the amount of units you have as well will impact which of these methods is most viable. So with that in mind, please rate the following methods as to how effective you think they will be from loading these units into a vessel. So we'll go from disagree being unsuitable to strongly agree being very suitable. And so it's a very difficult question to answer because there's so many variables in terms of what facilities are available, but it'd be interesting to gauge a sort of gut reaction to some of these methods. We've got bulk bags coming in quite strongly there. I think that's quite a sensible suggestion when looking at ways to reduce the impact on these units in their transportation to the site. Similarly to looking at the loading methods, the deployment methods, we are also trying to use these incumbent conventional methods, things like full pipes, flat top barges and hopper barges, as well as the articulated concrete mattresses that I just mentioned. And again, these have their trade-offs in terms of scale and cost. Full pipe, for example, you can deploy these units at a super precise level compared to something like a hopper barge where they are left to drop from the surface to the sea floor. And so they all have their advantages and disadvantages in terms of being used for our Eco-Reef products. So as before, if you want to rate the following methods as to how suitable you think they are for deploying these units from a vessel to the foundations or the cable routes, then I'll be interested to gauge your reaction. So this is really interesting in terms of the aims of our project, is we want to work with as many partners as we can. This is why we're working with people like Jan Denal and engaging in things like this, is to understand from all different stakeholders' point of view what's viable in terms of the deployment of these strategies, so that we can make products and solutions that are available from an industry perspective, as well as just ecological perspective. Concrete mattresses scoring the highest there, and that's something that we're really looking to focus on over the next few months with some of our new designs, and I'll talk about that briefly a little bit later as well. So now I'm just going to briefly talk about our strength testing program as part of this Living Windfarms project. Our aims here are to ensure that the spheres can actually be deployed using the proposed methods that I've just talked about. So to do this, we need to assess the survivability of the eco-reefs when subjected to the stresses and strains associated with delivery. There are three main aspects of this, and the first one being material strength testing, and also the theoretical shape strength. And these two really go hand in hand. So there's no good making the most strong material in the world if the shape of the object that you're making is inherently weak. And vice versa, you might have a very strong shape, but if the material that it's made out of is very weak, then you've still got a weak unit that won't survive when being deployed. And that's a very interesting engineering challenge for us to tackle. So once we've done some of this more theoretical and lab-based work, we will then do some physical impact testing to see what that looks like in the real world and make any changes that we need to. So starting off with the material testing, I've already talked a little bit about the J-block technology, but what we found with this technology is we can achieve high strength of 40 megapascals worth of compressive strength and 4 megapascals worth of tensile strength. And from a concrete point of view, this would be regarded as high strength concrete that would be suitable for engineering applications such as rock armor. And that's something that we've done down in Cornwall with the Environment Agency with those 5-ton rock armor units with these sort of material properties. Mentioned tensile strength, which isn't necessarily often quoted when looking at concrete strength figures, but it's really important for us to consider when looking at impacts and resilience to sort of bend stresses and things like that, because inherently concrete might be strong in terms of compressive strength, but relatively weak when it comes to flexing and that sort of thing. So that's a real challenge for us to investigate. So how are we improving this? So as I said before, we've already got a very strong base. So now we're looking at improving that even further. And we're looking at using reinforcing fibers, for example, such as glass fibers, natural flax fibers, and hemp as well. And we're testing these using the cylinder splitting tensile strength test, where you have your cylinder of the material that you're testing. There's a pressure that's applied from above and below. And at the point that it splits, that gives you your tensile strength level. Similarly, looking at compressive strength, if you have a cube of your material, which you then crush, the level of force that's required to crush it gives you your compressive strength value. We've been doing a lot of modeling, looking at the stresses and strains and how survivable the units are. So for example, we've been doing some hypothetical drop tests of our Eco-Reef spheres, both onto solid surfaces, but also onto water as well. And when we're doing these tests, we're considering all sorts of hypothetical material properties. So this tells us, oh, we can achieve a really high strength material by doing some of the various methods that I've just mentioned. Does that actually give us our overall strength that we desire when it's actually formed into the shape, or do we need to change the shape to be able to achieve that level of stress resilience? And finally, we'll bring all this together to inform our physical impact testing. And this will be able to give us the results in the real world to see how accurate those models and those predictions were, how effective those material strength changes are. And this will help us to work out what we need to do next. So for the next steps from these results, we can look at two main streams to adapt our products to these deployment methods. Firstly, we can look at improving the product, so either through the materials or the design of the shape. Alternatively, do we need to adapt deployment strategies to lower impact methods to be able to actually deploy our units at a large scale? And this comes on to some of our new designs. So people in the room will be able to see, I don't know if it comes up online, but we'll be able to see these units at the front. This is our original spherical unit, and this is our new unit, been dubbed the Exogon. And the process from here to here is looking to achieve various improvements, such as broadening the deployment options that are available. With a flattened off surface, this makes it a more viable solution for deploying or loading, I should say, using conveyor methods. The flat surfaces also make it more straightforward to incorporate surface textures in production. You can see we've got these hexagonal imprints on these flat surfaces here as an example. I should add that there's lots of flexibility to this design in terms of hole sizes, the size of the unit itself, which gives it flexibility in terms of targeting different species. Another improvement that we've made with it is it's weighted at the bottom, which means that when it settles on the seafloor, the idea there is that that increases the stability of the unit. Finally, it also lends itself to being woven together in some sort of mattress format. And this is something we're looking to really pursue as a means of deployment, especially for things like cable routes. So you can see here that we've already started along this product development timeline. We've got some lab analysis lined up looking at these in flume experiments. And we've also done some modeling already to look at the survivability of these units. And we have a prototype there ready to go to make some refinements to as well. And then hopefully in the spring of next year, we'll have some pilot studies of these deployed as well. So that covers everything for my last talk. I went through it a little bit quicker so we could get more time of this sort of open floor discussions. I know there are lots of points that were raised that people would probably like to discuss further from earlier on in the session. So thanks very much, and hand over to the open floor discussion.
Right. Thank you very much, Will. That was most excellent. Yeah, very happy to open up to the floor. I think there is already some hands raised there. So can I pass to Paul Peters, please? This question.
Thank you so much for giving me the word, and also thank you for the very clear presentation. I think the images served your message very well. Excited to see how this is going. Obviously, I'm program lead of the Artificial Reach program for Pascalis, and I've been watching your technology, of course, develop over time. I'm happy you shifted from the perfect squares back to something what you call the Exogon. It's a very nice naming. I was wondering, in my initial feedback to the design, I indicated that intrinsically these units will always be more expensive per weight or per volume compared to natural rock. So therefore, in terms of business case, they're going to be more expensive to install. Normally, I would say for a given project budget, I would then expect if you look at scour protection, it will only be a fraction of the scour protection that will be placed with these units, the Exogons, and most of it will be probably still rock. So therefore, the defining feature probably in the marine ecosystem or the community that's created is probably still the rock, right? That's still the governing available marine habitat that will be there to scour protection, because the Exogons being in a lesser fraction there. How do you view that in terms of creating tangible environmental value compared to the return on investment?
Okay, that's a very good question. Thank you, Paul. So we've envisaged that the Eco-Reef units we placed on a filter layer. So the filter layer we placed initially with traditional rock or finer layer, depending on the environmental conditions, with the Eco-Reefs placed on top. So we are looking at methods of mass production as well as mass deployment using conventional techniques, as Will explained. But yeah, you're very right. We can't actually compete price-wise with quarried rock, and as such we're focusing on the biodiversity gains that we deem we can achieve for these aspects.
So you would maybe use a bit more as like a coating on the outer side to give that biological availability on top of the filter layer then?
Yes, I think because the filter layer is generally going to be covered with rock and has a lesser important function in relation to the reef function of a hard substrate habitat, and therefore there's no point in using the artificial reefs as a base layer, if you like. So we would only use it as a top layer.
Yes.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Or maybe, I don't know who knows the answer, but you talked about price points and you talked about not asking for private information, but if carbon becomes money and these are cheaper than rock, you've told us on the poster in the room that this could be 17%. What does that do to the argument? We've already got marine dredging gets charged based on carbon, not enough at the moment, but it generates an awful lot of money at their excess because of their carbon footprint. If mining of rock for scour protection has a carbon footprint, and that's brought into the price point moving forward, will that mean that maybe we should be deploying 10 million of these off the back of the boat without worrying about how they hit the bottom of the ocean in the same way that we would about rock?
Yeah, that's a good point, Tom. So we use various sources of recycled material that's incorporated in this, including dredge material on certain projects. These units that are here today, they've actually been made with quarry waste. Yeah, and as such, there is those circular economy aspects to consider and carbon sequestration aspects to consider. We are looking further in carbon sequestration, and we have a project lined up for this spring. So yeah, I can probably tell a bit more about that in the next webinar. And I think I can see that Justin also
might just sort of respond to that point as well quickly. It's sort of, the idea of these sort of broadening out from carbon, like ecosystem services on a broader scale as well, and things like payment for ecosystem services. These might not happen off their own back, but if there is significant push, then that could be an opportunity there. And also things like the biodiversity net gain, which has happened in sort of terrestrial and intertidal environments in England. Is obviously there are imperfections with how that's calculated. Possibly that's something for us to try and work out how that works. But if that comes into force in the marine environment, then that adds another push, as well as sort of the economic pull factors, if you like, of sort of cheap quarried rocks. So something else to consider as well.
Yeah. So yeah, definitely a conversation to be continued. Justin, can I pass over to you?
Thanks, William. Yeah, no, really interesting, all of this. So I've had to dip in and out a bit, but it's really encouraging from an end user point of view to to know that this sort of really in-depth knowledge is being developed. Relatively behind the scenes, I guess you'd sort of say, from an environment agency point of view. But obviously, William, we're involved with you in the work at Newlyn, and really great to see that progressing. And I had a sort of specific point, actually, I just from the last presentation, which was sort of understanding the relative increasing importance of porosity of the blocks, as we think about sort of deploying in intertidal areas, as we are in Newlyn, as opposed to subtidal areas, where the blocks remain wetted all the time. Sort of one of the sort of concepts in my mind was that actually having a product which retained moisture more effectively than a standard bit of quarried granite was actually a part of the advantage. So is that does the sort of evidence support that?
Yeah, I think so. There has been a really good report by Jesbone and Rick Strafford as well on concrete surfaces that kind of highlights that in a subtidal environment, it doesn't really matter too much how porous something is. but so in relation to concrete, that is not actually natural rock. But in the intertidal environment, it does kind of make a big difference. The biggest factor is how well the concept can hold water or retain water, not necessarily in the porosity of it, but having kind of hexagon features that we use, for example, how well that holds water actually improves the colonization of it. And that's what we've been kind of focusing on for our intertidal applications. It's a complex question because the porosity and the complexity of an artificial reef directly influences the strength and also potentially the hydrodynamic impact. So the more complex something is, it creates turbulence, hydrodynamic turbulence, and we will actually have a presentation on that in our next workshop. We focused a little bit more on kind of hydrodynamics. Again, this is subtidal rather than intertidal. So there is a lot of processes at work. So we can't actually say it's better to have a more porous product because it will be more intrinsically weak, and as such will have a shorter lifespan. Sorry, I'm not sure if that answers your question, Justin.
No, well, no, it does, and I recognise it's complex, and I'll look forward to joining the next workshop then if I can, because it is something I'm interested in. And just briefly, just to pick up on the carbon aspect, I mean, I think that is as you know, William, it's a sort of a key component of this work for us is understanding not just the carbon minimization that can be achieved, but the long-term mitigation. So it's that carbon sequestration potential that we can build into schemes and defensive designs, so that we might look to calculate a future point at which our scheme becomes carbon neutral and ultimately a net carbon sink. And we're already obviously sort of encouraged through whatever means to reduce our, from an organizational perspective, reduce our carbon budget. But I think there will be ways of effectively monetizing that or realizing funding to deliver schemes with those technologies that can help us deliver not just the minimization, but mitigation. So it's adaptation and mitigation. Both of those bits of the carbon conversation are what need to be considered.
Yeah, okay. Perhaps that's a good question, good topic as well for the next workshop to consider. And all the calculations that we've done is by using the Environment Agency calculator, so we can be open book with you about that as well, and you can look into how we've calculated and where potentially we can make improvements. So there's a question here in the room as well.
Just a comment coming back to your talk about porosity. I mean, the first things that are going to colonise those are always going to be microbes. And I imagine that porosity would have a very strong impact on diversity of microbes and also functions as well, because the porous surface like that in comparison to granite is going to allow both anaerobic and aerobic processes. You're going to get oxygen gradients out of those pores. You have a much higher surface area for attachment because it includes within structure as well as external. So it would be good to build in monitoring of that into the future.
Yeah, very good point. But that still, leaves the complexity of having a product that's strong enough to withstand the survivability of the journey.
But a lot of natural products in the marine environment, like our carbonate and coral reefs, have that sort of structure.
Yeah.
And you can have ammonia oxidation happening in very close proximity to denitrification, with things being exchanged through the pores.
Yeah.
I think that's a really fascinating point that brings a range of discussions together, because we heard in the larger components of biodiversity that porosity was found that after a short period of time didn't affect the final structure of the benthic community. So that makes sense that it would in the short term and it might not in the long term. And then we had the conversation about what is biodiversity and moving on from thinking about things we can always see to the functions that those communities provide. And this is particularly important thinking about this session now in carbon, but also carbon cycling and pollution and remediation, and that these porous structures, while might not enhance or make a difference in the kind of macro faunal biodiversity, they might make a huge difference in terms of the ecological function or even other ways in which these products might be useful. So you can put these products in an area, a decommissioning area, and if they're porous, they might help absorb all sorts of nasties that you can then physically remove again. Whereas if they're not porous, they wouldn't be able to do that so much. So it just really kind of changed the perspective of how we consider the interaction between biodiversity and services and function.
Yeah.
One thing we do know is natural coral reefs are capturing more, they have more carbon than sediments. There's actually great sequestration later on, not just in the sediment, over time, but the artificial reefs next to them, although we don't know why. There are differences in the macro community structure as well, so but we haven't quite worked that out stuff here. Equally, in terms of carbon sequestration, if you're talking about wind farms, additional things as well, like things like kelp farming, co-locating kelp farming, with a much bigger effect on the soil than what you end up doing with that kelp. On carbon sequestration, the small bits of algae and the things growing on artificial reefs, I think that's a much bigger impact by this.
Okay. Great. There's 2 more questions, and then we'll look to wrap up. So, Lee, do you mind going first?
Thanks very much. Firstly, just want to say it's a great workshop. So, congratulations to everyone who's organised this, and it's been really, really good. Apologise for the dogs in the background as well. It's probably a question more for Aline. I suppose I'd like to understand the sort of experience with regulators and consenting authorities to creating a habitat close to a rotating generator, and the sort of interactions with collision risk for birds, and are there any mitigation options there?
Well, we focus on underwater. So yes, there are definitely risks for birds, but I think that's a completely different sport, so to say. Yeah. So we really focus underwater. So I can't really answer your question for birds.
Okay, thank you.
A tiny bit of context. I don't know the full details, but certainly, you know, the RSPB line, as I understand it, isn't actually empty offshore wind anymore. Yeah. So where you put those wind farms, you don't put on bird migration routes, sensible measures. But yeah, there is a risk that this, you know, the need for offshore wind is so high that even, you know, charities like RSPB aren't necessarily proposing it anymore.
No, they've done the mapping of the routes deliberately, particularly for the big immobile species like geese and swans. But I am interested in Lee's question from a different context, and I'm not expecting an answer, but just think about it. Maybe it's nice to have it recorded, that if we use wind farms as restoring habitats, particularly in shallow areas of the North Sea, do those habitats then become attractive for species that will create conflicts with wind farm that don't, in locations that there's currently no conflicts? So fisheries recovery, shellfish, particularly mussel and clam recovery, will attract diving birds and diving ducks that feed on shellfish that are currently restricted in their range because they've lost their habitats. And so, whereas we're building risks and mitigation into the current landscape, we need to future-proof those risks because there is potentially risks there. I'm not asking a question, I'm just thinking that Lee's question is actually quite interesting from a context we maybe haven't thought about. That habitat recovery can actually lead to conflict. And we need to think about that.
Yeah. Because it's something that we think about with the North Sea Foundation quite a lot. And what we also come back to is that the current legislation, especially in Europe, is very species focused. And if you're going to change the system by implementing wind farms everywhere, you're going to change the system, right? And if you look at species level, you're going to have to accept that certain species are going to suffer, right? So for example, gannets maybe that are very sensitive for collision, yeah, we might have to accept that they will decline, or maybe species that are affected in feeding habitats or something like that. And so maybe the species focus is something that we should let go of a little bit and focus more on an ecosystem view or a system view. So, but that is definitely a problem in legislation right now. And yeah, we come across that quite a lot. Yeah.
Okay.
And yeah, I think for the future, it's also with climate change, if you focus on species, right now the species that we would want maybe are not suitable for the future, you know, when temperatures rise, things like that. Yeah.
Can I ask if that thought process is going on within adaptability?
Yes.
It is.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Okay, we've got one final question from Anna.
Thank you. It's two quick questions about the laboratory testing you've performed, specifically the flume testing. I wanted to know if there's been any public dissemination of the flume testing results, maybe in a paper, or if there's a paper in the works. And the second question is if you've done any testing incorporating a pile to replicate the real scour conditions around foundations.
I can say that both questions that we're working on those. So the first amount of testing is currently being written up to be publicized, which will include a cable crossing as well. We're planning for next year a full foundation test run as well as continuing testing new prototypes. So there is quite a large program of testing in the pipeline. It's just not going as quick as we probably ought to go, but yeah, that will be available. And if you wouldn't mind just contacting me with that question, I can share some initial results with you. But yeah, there's no full paper available just yet.
Great, thank you.
Right, any questions in the room? Final remarks before we wrap up? No, well, I'll finish off then by saying thank you to everyone that's participated. I think it's been a very good mix of different views, different approaches, a very diverse discussion, which leads very nicely into the future workshop that we're planning in about 3 or 4 months' time. So do look out on our website. You are on our mailing list, so we'll contact you and let you know when that's going to happen. There will be, again, a different variety of speakers. If you have any topics in particular that you like to discuss, then please let us know, and we can address that. And yeah, thank you so much. And that's all.